Some nights, the dead refuse to stay buried in your memory. My name is Marcus Williams, and I've been the night janitor at Riverside Memorial Home for 8 years now. It's not glamorous work mopping floors, emptying trash, making sure the building stays secure while the living world sleeps. But it pays the bills, and there's something peaceful about the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. At least, there used to be. I start my shift at 11 p.m., when the last family members have said their goodbyes and the funeral directors have locked up for the night. The building settles into its nighttime rhythm, the hum of air conditioning, the occasional creak of old wooden floors, the distant sound of traffic from the highway. I've got my routine down to a science check: the locks, empty the waste baskets in the offices, sweep the lobby, then work my way through the viewing rooms, room by room, methodical and thorough. In 8 years, I've seen everything you'd expect in a place like this. Families who linger too long saying goodbye, flowers that wilt overnight, the occasional drunk who wanders in thinking we're still open, nothing that would keep me awake during the day. The viewing rooms are arranged in a horseshoe around the main hallway, numbered 1 through 9. Room 7 sits right in the middle, with large windows facing the parking lot and 2 rows of chairs set up for services. It's where we hold most of our larger funerals, the ones that draw 50 or 60 people. Mrs. Chen's service had been in room 7 back in October. Lung cancer, if I remember right. Her daughter had chosen a beautiful blue dress for the viewing, something elegant with small pearl buttons. The whole family had been their children, grandchildren, even some great-grandchildren running around in their Sunday best. It was the kind of service that reminds you why people need places like this. Spaces to gather and remember and say goodbye properly. The first time I noticed something odd was a Tuesday night in early November, about 3 weeks after Mrs. Chen's funeral. I was finishing up in room 6 when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from room 7. Soft steps, like someone walking carefully across carpet in dress shoes. I figured maybe one of the directors had forgotten something and come back for it, though that was unusual. When I poked my head into the hallway, everything was quiet. The motion sensor lights were off, and room 7's door was closed, just like I'd left it after cleaning earlier. I shrugged it off and continued my rounds. But the next night, same thing: footsteps, from room 7 around 3 in the morning. This time, I walked over and listened at the door. Nothing. I used my master key to check inside, and the room was empty. Chairs lined up perfectly, carpet showing vacuum lines from where I'd cleaned the day before. I started wondering if the old building was just settling, or maybe we had mice in the walls. Old buildings make strange noises, especially at night when everything's quiet. It was the security footage that made me realize something wasn't right. Riverside had installed a new camera system the year before, high-definition cameras in every room and hallway. I had access to the monitors in the security office, mostly so I could check that I'd locked up properly or see if any lights had been left on. Thursday morning, after another night of hearing those soft footsteps, I decided to review the footage from room 7. What I saw made my coffee go cold in my hands. At exactly 3:07 a.m., clear as day, there was a woman standing beside casket 7. She was wearing a blue dress with pearl buttons, her gray hair pinned up in a neat bun. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, looking down at the casket with an expression I couldn't quite read from the grainy footage. The timestamp showed she appeared at 3:07 and vanished at 3:08, exactly 1 minute of footage. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. I had been in the hallway during that exact time, cleaning room 6. I would have seen anyone enter or leave room 7. The door had never opened. I rewound the footage and watched it again, then again. The woman was definitely there, solid and real as anyone. She cast a shadow on the carpet, and when she moved slightly, adjusting her position beside the casket, the fabric of her dress shifted naturally. This wasn't some camera glitch or trick of the light. I fast-forwarded through the rest of the night's footage. Nothing else unusual, just me going about my normal routine, looking increasingly puzzled as I stood in the hallway listening to sounds that apparently had no source. My hands were shaking as I logged into the computer system and pulled up our recent services. Mrs. Chen. Viewing held in room 7, October 15th through 17th. I scrolled through the funeral director's notes. Family selected blue dress with pearl detail, provided by daughter. Viewing scheduled for 3 days, burial at Greenwood Cemetery following Saturday service. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The woman in the footage looked exactly like Mrs. Chen, down to the hairstyle and the dress. But Mrs. Chen had been buried 3 weeks ago. That night, I positioned myself in the hallway outside room 7 at 3 a.m. I had a clear view of the door and windows, and I'd checked the room thoroughly beforehand, empty, locked, undisturbed. At 3:06, I felt the temperature drop about 10 degrees, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had opened a walk-in freezer. My breath started coming out in small puffs, and I could see frost forming on the metal door handle of room 7. At exactly 3:07, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were unmistakable, the soft click of low heels on carpet, moving slowly around the room. I tried the door handle, and it turned easily, despite being locked moments before. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and something else I couldn't identify, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of the flower arrangements from Mrs. Chen's service. My flashlight beam swept across the chairs, the carpet, the empty space where casket 7 had been positioned during the viewing. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, circling slowly around the room as if someone was walking the perimeter, examining every detail. I followed the sound with my flashlight, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The beam passed over the spot where the casket had been, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw the outline of a figure, a faint impression in the air, like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the temperature began to return to normal. By 3:08, the room felt ordinary again, just another empty space waiting for the next service. I spent the rest of my shift in the security office, reviewing footage from previous nights. October 18th, the night after Mrs. Plotkin. Chen's burial. There she was, at 3:07 a.m., standing beside the empty space where her casket had been. October 19th, same time, same position. Every single night since her funeral, Mrs. Chen had returned to room 7 for exactly 1 minute, always wearing the blue dress her daughter had chosen for her final viewing. I thought about calling the funeral director, or maybe Mrs. Chen's family, but what would I say? That their mother and grandmother was visiting her own viewing room every night? That she seemed to be keeping some kind of appointment that death hadn't canceled? Instead, I started leaving room 7 unlocked during my rounds. If Mrs. Chen wanted to visit, the least I could do was make sure she didn't have to deal with a locked door. The visitations continued every night, regular as clockwork. 3:07 to 3:08, 1 minute of standing vigil beside the space where her casket had been. I stopped being afraid and started feeling something else, a deep sadness for a woman who seemed unable to let go of her own goodbye. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway and listen to those soft footsteps, wondering what kept bringing her back. Was there something unfinished? Some word left unsaid during those 3 days of viewing? On Christmas Eve, something changed. The footsteps lasted longer, maybe 2 or 3 minutes instead of 1. And for the first time, I heard something else, a soft humming, like a lullaby sung under someone's breath. It was a tune I recognized but couldn't quite place, something old and comforting. When I checked the security footage later, Mrs. Chen was still there at 3:07, but this time she wasn't alone. A small figure stood beside her, a child maybe 6 or 7 years old, holding her hand. They stood together looking at the empty space where the casket had been, and Mrs. Chen's free hand rested gently on the child's shoulder. I never found out who the child was. The footage was too grainy to make out details, and they were gone by 3:09. But I remembered something from Mrs. Chen's servitor daughter mentioning how much Mrs. Chen had missed her youngest grandson, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. She never got over losing little David, the daughter had said during the eulogy. She used to hum his favorite song when she missed him too much. 3 months have passed since that Christmas Eve visitation. Mrs. Chen still returns every night at 3:07, but now she's never alone. Sometimes it's the small boy. Sometimes other figures I can't quite make out in the grainy security footage. Family members, maybe, or friends who went before her. They gather around the empty space where Casket 7 sits during services, a reunion that happens in the quiet hours when the living world is asleep. I've stopped trying to understand it. Some things don't need explanation, just acknowledgement. Every night I unlock room 7 and make sure the chairs are arranged properly. The carpet is clean, the windows are clear. It's become part of my routine, this small act of hospitality for visitors who technically shouldn't exist. Mrs. Chen was always welcome in room 7 during her viewing, and I figure that welcome shouldn't expire just because the service is over. Last week, Mrs. Chen's daughter came by to make arrangements for her father, who passed away from the same lung cancer that took his wife. She asked if we could use room 7 for the viewing, the same room where they'd said goodbye to Mrs. Chen 7 months ago. He'd want to be in the same place, she said. They were married 53 years. He never got used to sleeping alone. I nodded and made a note in the schedule book. Room 7, 3 days of viewing, burial to follow. I didn't mention the nightly visits, or the security footage, or the soft footsteps that echo through the empty room every morning at 3:07. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when they bring comfort to the living, and apparently provide some kind of peace for the dead. But I have a feeling that when Mr. Chen's viewing is over, and the last family member has said goodbye, room 7 won't be empty anymore. During those quiet pre-dawn hours, Mrs. Chen won't be keeping her vigil alone, and maybe, finally, she'll be able to rest. Cold has a way of seeping into your bones when you're not expecting it. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've been the night custodian at Westfield Funeral Home for 6 years. It's honest work cleaning, maintaining equipment, making sure everything's ready for the morning staff. The preparation room is part of my nightly routine, though it's not a place most people would want to spend time alone. Stainless steel tables, chemical storage, industrial sinks, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look pale and lifeless. But after 6 years, you get used to the clinical atmosphere. At least, you're supposed to. I start my shift at midnight, when the embalmers and funeral directors have gone home for the night. The building settles into its nighttime quiet just, the hum of refrigeration units, the occasional creak of settling wood, and my footsteps echoing through empty hallways. I've got a system. Start with the offices, move through the viewing rooms, then finish with the preparation areas. The prep room always comes last because it takes the most time. All those surfaces need to be sanitized, the floors mopped with industrial disinfectant, the equipment checked and secured. It's meticulous work, but I take pride in leaving everything spotless for the morning crew. The preparation room has 4 stainless steel tables arranged in a square, each equipped with its own drainage system and adjustable lighting. Table 3 sits in the far corner, positioned under a small window that looks out onto the parking lot. During the day, a thin stream of natural light filters through, but at night, it's just a black rectangle reflecting the fluorescent tubes overhead. I've cleaned around all 4 tables thousands of times, and they're identical, same manufacturer, same model, same cold steel surface that requires the same careful attention to detail. Mr. Garrett's preparation had taken place on table 3 back in early November. I remember because his case had affected everyone who worked on it. 68 years old, found frozen in his backyard after apparently falling during an ice storm. His neighbor discovered him the next morning, curled up near his back steps like he'd been trying to get inside. The coroner said he'd been out there for hours in sub-freezing temperatures. Hypothermia, plain and simple. His daughter mentioned during the arrangement conference that he'd always hated being cold, kept his house at 75 degrees year-round, and wore sweaters even in summer. The first time I noticed something unusual was a Tuesday night in late November, about 3 weeks after Mr. Garrett's service. I was halfway through mopping the prep room when I realized I could see my breath. The room felt like a walk-in freezer, and when I checked the thermostat, it read 34 degrees. That didn't make sense. The building's climate control was set to maintain 68 degrees throughout, and the prep room had its own heating system to prevent chemicals from freezing. I adjusted the thermostat back to 68 and continued cleaning, figuring it was just a malfunction. But the next night, same thing. 34 degrees at exactly midnight, my breath coming out in small puffs as I worked. This time, I paid closer attention to the thermostat, watching it climb slowly back to normal as I reset it. The strange thing was how the cold felt not like a broken heater or faulty ventilation, but like the deeper cold of winter nights, the kind that makes your skin ache and your joints stiffen. It reminded me of the weather reports from the night Mr. Garrett died. 34 degrees with freezing rain. I started bringing a thermometer with me, the kind with a digital readout that responds quickly to temperature changes. Every night, the same pattern. The prep room would drop to exactly 34 degrees sometime between midnight and 4 a.m. And every night I'd reset the thermostat and watch the temperature climb back to normal. I mentioned it to the day supervisor, and he promised to have the HVAC system checked. The technician found nothing wrong. New thermostat, clean ducts, calibrated sensors, everything tested perfectly. But the temperature drops continued. It was during my 4th week of dealing with the temperature problem that I noticed something else. While mopping around the tables, I realized that table 3 wasn't as cold as the others. At first I thought it was just my imagination. Metal surfaces in a cold room should all feel the same. But when I pressed my palm against table 3, it felt noticeably warmer than tables 1, 2, and 4. Not warm exactly, but not the bone-deep cold of the others either. Room temperature, maybe, while everything else felt like it had been stored in a freezer. I started testing all 4 tables every night, using my bare hands to gauge the temperature difference. Tables 1, 2, and 4 were always frigid when the room dropped to 34 degrees, cold enough to make my palms ache after a few seconds of contact. But table 3 maintained a consistent warmth, as if it had its own internal heating system. I ran my hands along its entire surface, the steel top, the drainage channels, the adjustment mechanisms, and every inch of it felt the same, comfortably warm while the rest of the room turned Arctic. The night crew supervisor, Janet, started joining me on my rounds after I mentioned the temperature anomaly. She'd worked at Westfield for 15 years and had never seen anything like it. We'd enter the prep room together around 1 a.m., both bundling up in extra jackets as the cold hit us, and watch as our breath turned visible in the frigid air. But when Janet placed her hands on table 3, her expression shifted from skepticism to confusion. "That's not possible," she kept saying, pressing her palms against the warm steel. "Metal doesn't work that way. It should be the same temperature as everything else in the room." We tried everything we could think of to explain it. Checked for heating elements hidden in the table's base, looked for electrical connections that might indicate warming coils, even brought in a maintenance worker to examine the table's construction. Table 3 was identical to the other 3 tables. In every measurable way, same materials, same manufacturing date, same installation. There was no mechanical reason for it to maintain a different temperature than its surroundings. But the strangest discovery came when I was cleaning late one Thursday night in December. The room had dropped to its usual 34 degrees, and I was working my way around table 3 with disinfectant and cleaning cloths. As I wiped down the steel surface, I noticed that my cleaning rag stayed warm longer than usual, as if the table was radiating heat upward. When I pressed my ear against the steel, something I'd never thought to do before, I could swear I heard something like breathing. Not loud, not obvious, but a faint, rhythmic sound like someone taking slow, steady breaths. I pulled back and listened to the room. The refrigeration units hummed in their usual pattern. The building's heating system cycled on and off. But underneath those familiar sounds, coming from somewhere inside or beneath table 3, was that soft breathing sound. Inhale, exhale, pause. Inhale, exhale, pause. The rhythm was slower than normal human breathing, like someone in deep sleep or meditation. I put my ear back to the table surface, and the sound was definitely there, quiet but unmistakable. Janet thought I was imagining things until she heard it herself. We stood in the frigid prep room at 2 a.m., both leaning over table 3 with our ears pressed to the warm steel, listening to something that shouldn't exist breathe steadily beneath the surface. "Maybe it's the building settling," Janet whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Buildings don't settle in rhythmic patterns. They don't maintain the exact cadence of human breathing. The breathing continued every night after that, always during the hours when the room dropped to 34 degrees. But it wasn't just breathing anymore. Sometimes I could hear what sounded like shivering, small, rapid movements, like someone trying to generate warmth through muscle contractions. Other times, very faintly, I heard what might have been words, though I could never make out what was being said. The sounds were muffled, distant, as if coming from somewhere deep inside the table structure. One night in late December, almost 2 months after Mr. Garrett's service, I decided to stay in the prep room during the entire cold period, from midnight until 4 a.m. I brought a chair, a thermos of coffee, and a thick blanket, positioning myself next to table 3 to monitor whatever was happening. At exactly midnight, the temperature plummeted to 34 degrees. The familiar cold settled over everything except table 3, which remained warm to the touch. At 1:30 a.m., the breathing sounds intensified. Instead of the slow, steady rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, the breathing became rapid and shallow, almost panicked. I pressed my ear to the table surface and heard something that made my blood freeze, despite the warm steel against my skin. Mixed in with the breathing were words, spoken in a voice I recognized from the arrangement conference 2 months earlier. "So cold," the voice whispered. "Can't get warm. Can't get inside." It was Mr. Garrett's voice, weak and plaintive, repeating the same phrases over and over. "So cold. Can't get warm. Can't get inside." The words came between ragged breaths, as if he was struggling against some invisible weight or barrier. I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the floor, and the sounds stopped immediately. The room fell silent except for the building's mechanical noises, but table 3 remained warm beneath my trembling hands. I spent the rest of that night in the break room, drinking coffee and trying to process what I'd heard. When the day staff arrived, I pulled up Mr. Garrett's file and read through the coroner's report. The details matched what I'd heard in that voice: a man who died from exposure, found outside his own home, apparently unable to reach the warmth and safety that was just a few feet away. The report noted that he'd been wearing only light clothing, inadequate for the freezing temperatures that killed him. 3 months have passed since that December night, and the temperature anomaly continues. Every night between midnight and 4 a.m., the prep room drops to exactly 34 degrees, the same temperature as the night Mr. Garrett died. And every night, table 3 maintains its inexplicable warmth, as if providing the heat that Mr. Garrett never found in life. I still hear the breathing sometimes, and occasionally the whispered words, but they've grown fainter over time, less desperate. I've stopped trying to explain it to others. Janet transferred to day shifts after Christmas, claiming she couldn't handle the night work anymore. The new night supervisor doesn't ask questions about the temperature readings, and I don't volunteer information about the sounds coming from table 3. Some experiences are too strange to share, too personal to make sense to anyone who wasn't there. But I've started doing something that feels right, even if I can't explain why. During those cold hours when the prep room drops to 34 degrees, I bring an extra blanket and drape it over table 3. It's just a small gesture, probably meaningless, but it makes me feel like I'm offering something Mr. Garrett never had: a moment of warmth in the cold. In the morning, I fold the blanket and put it away, and the day staff never needs to know about the small kindness shared between the living and whatever remains of those who died without enough heat to keep them alive. The table stays warm regardless, but sometimes I think the breathing sounds a little more peaceful under the blanket's weight. Some signatures outlast the hands that wrote them. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been the night security guard at Meadowbrook Cemetery for 4 years now. It's not the kind of job most people would choose, but it suits me: fine quiet hours, decent pay, and the kind of solitude that lets you think without interruption. The cemetery covers about 50 acres of rolling hills and old oak trees, with sections dating back to the 1800s. My job is straightforward: patrol the grounds, check the locks on the maintenance buildings, and make sure nobody's causing trouble among the headstones. Most nights, the only company I have is the occasional deer or raccoon wandering through the older sections. The main office sits near the front gates, a small brick building that houses the administrative records and serves as a checkpoint for visitors during regular hours. There's a simple visitor's log by the front door, just a basic composition book where people can sign in if they're visiting after the main office closes at 5 p.m. Family members sometimes come by in the evening to leave flowers or spend a few quiet minutes at a gravesite, and the log helps us keep track of who's been on the property. It's an old-fashioned system, but it works for a place that values tradition and respect for the deceased. I start my rounds at 10 p.m., when the last of the evening visitors have usually gone home. The first stop is always the main office, where I check the visitor's log and make note of any after-hours entries. Most evenings, there are 2 or 3 signatures from people who stop by to visit family graves names I recognize, from years of seeing the same visitors return to the same plots. Mrs. Patterson visits her husband's grave every Tuesday. The Miller family comes by on weekends to tend their son's headstone. These are the regular patterns of grief and remembrance that give a cemetery its rhythm. For the past 3 years, one signature appeared in the log almost every night: Harold Morrison, visiting Emma, written in careful, old-fashioned script. Harold was in his 70s, a retired postal worker who had been coming to Meadowbrook since his wife's burial in 1987. He always arrived around sunset and stayed for exactly 1 hour, sitting on the small bench beside Emma's grave in Section C. I'd gotten to know Harold during my rounds, a quiet, dignified man who spoke about his wife as if she'd just stepped out of the room for a moment. 43 years of marriage, he told me once. You don't just stop talking to someone after 43 years. Harold passed away last spring from a heart attack, and I attended his funeral at the Methodist Church downtown. His burial was held at Meadowbrook, in the plot right next to Emma's, just as he'd arranged years earlier. It was a simple service, with about 30 people in attendance, mostly neighbors, and a few distant relatives. After the burial, I assumed that would be the end of the nightly signatures in the visitor's log. Harold had been our most consistent after-hours visitor, and with him gone, I expected the evening entries to drop back to the occasional family member or friend. But 2 weeks after Harold's funeral, I found a new signature in the visitor's log. Same elegant handwriting, same careful script, but this time it read, "Still waiting, E.M." The initials were written in the exact style as Harold's signature, with the same distinctive loops on the capital letters and the same slight backward slant. I stared at the entry for several minutes, trying to make sense of it. E.M. could stand for Emma Morrison, but that was impossible. Emma had been dead for 37 years, and the handwriting was unmistakably the same as Harold's nightly signatures. I checked the security cameras that cover the main office and front gate area. The footage showed nothing unusual, no visitors entering or leaving the property after closing time. But there was the signature in the log, written in blue ink that was still slightly wet when I found it around 10:30 p.m. I made a note in my security report and figured it was probably just someone playing a prank, though I couldn't imagine who would know enough about Harold and Emma to create such a specific joke. The next night, another entry. Still waiting, E.M. Same handwriting, same blue ink, same time frame. I started checking the visitor's log multiple times during my rounds, and I could narrow down when the signatures appeared always between 9:30 and 10 p.m., always in that same elegant script. The security cameras continued to show nothing, just empty grounds and the locked main office building. No one was accessing the building during those hours, yet the signatures kept appearing with clockwork regularity. I brought the issue to my supervisor, Jerry, who suggested we move the visitor's log inside the office and keep the building locked at all times. That way, only staff members with keys could access the book, and we could determine if someone was somehow getting inside without being detected by the cameras. It seemed like a reasonable solution to what was probably just an elaborate prank by someone with too much time on their hands. But moving the log inside didn't stop the signatures. Every morning when I unlocked the office to end my shift, there was a new entry. Still waiting, EM. The handwriting remained consistent, and the ink was always fresh, as if someone had signed the book just minutes before my arrival. Jerry installed additional security cameras inside the office, covering every angle of the room where the visitor's log was kept. We reviewed the footage each morning, and it showed the same thing every time: an empty office with no signs of entry or disturbance. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to conduct an experiment. Instead of checking the visitor's log during my 10 p.m. rounds, I positioned myself in the parking lot with a clear view of the main office building. If someone was somehow getting inside to sign the book, I would see them enter or leave. I sat in my patrol car with binoculars and a thermos of coffee, watching the office windows and door from 9 p.m. until 11 p.m. At exactly 9:45 p.m., I saw a light flicker on inside the office. Not the overhead fluorescence, but a softer light, like someone holding a flashlight or candle. The light moved across the windows in a purposeful way, as if someone was walking through the room. I immediately called for backup and approached the building, using my key to unlock the front door. The office was empty, but the visitor's log was open to a fresh page with a new signature. Still waiting, EM. The ink was still wet enough to smudge when I touched it with my finger. The paper felt warm, as if someone had just been leaning over it to write. But the room was empty, and all the windows were locked from the inside. I spent the next hour searching every corner of the office, checking for hidden entrances or signs of how someone could have entered and left without being seen. I found nothing except that fresh signature and the lingering scent of lavender, faint but unmistakable. Jerry brought in a private investigator the following week, a former police detective who specialized in security issues. He installed motion detectors throughout the office, set up infrared cameras that could detect heat signatures, and even dusted the visitor's log for fingerprints. The motion detectors never triggered during the hours when the signatures appeared. The infrared cameras showed no heat sources moving through the room, and the only fingerprints on the book belonged to staff members and regular visitors from during business hours. Yet, every morning brought the same result. Still waiting, EM. Written in Harold's elegant script, the ink fresh and the paper warm to the touch. The investigator spent 3 nights monitoring the office personally, sitting in the room with all his equipment running. On the 3rd night, he watched the signature appear while he was sitting less than 5 feet from the visitor's log. The pen lifted from its holder beside the book, moved across the page in deliberate strokes, and returned to its position. The entire process took about 30 seconds, and there was no visible hand guiding the pen. The investigator quit the case the next day, citing equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena beyond the scope of normal security work. Jerry decided to stop pursuing the issue, figuring that as long as nothing was being damaged or stolen, a mysterious signature wasn't worth the ongoing expense of trying to solve it. The cemetery board agreed, and we returned to our normal routine of checking the log each morning and noting the entry in our records. But I started noticing other changes around Emma Morrison's gravesite. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, always white roses arranged in a simple bouquet. The small bench beside her headstone showed signs of recent use-compressed cushions and scuff marks on the ground in front of it, as if someone had been sitting there regularly. When I checked the area during my nightly rounds, it was always empty, but by morning there were new signs that someone had been there. One night in late October, about 6 months after Harold's death, I decided to spend my entire shift near Emma's grave. I positioned myself behind a large oak tree about 50 feet away, with a clear view of the headstone and bench. If someone was visiting the grave after hours, I was determined to see who it was and finally solve the mystery of the nightly signatures. At 9:45 p.m., the same time the signatures usually appeared in the visitor's log, I saw a figure approaching Emma's grave. It was Harold Morrison, walking slowly up the path with a bouquet of white roses in his hand. He moved with the same careful gait I remembered from our conversations during his evening visits, wearing the same gray cardigan he'd favored during cool weather. I watched as he sat down on the bench, arranged the flowers against Emma's headstone, and began talking quietly to the grave, as he'd done for years. I couldn't hear his words from my position behind the tree, but his posture and gestures were exactly as I remembered, leaning forward slightly, hands clasped, speaking in the measured cadence of someone continuing a long conversation. He sat there for exactly 1 hour, just as he always had in life, then stood up and walked back down the path toward the main office. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows of the larger monuments and mausoleums. Harold stopped at the main office building, and I watched as he approached the front door. He didn't unlock it or break in, simply walked through the door as if it wasn't there. A few minutes later, he emerged the same way and continued down the path toward the front gates. As he walked, his figure became less distinct, more translucent, until finally he simply faded from view near the entrance to Section A. I ran to the main office and unlocked the door with trembling hands. The visitor's log was open to a fresh page, and there was the familiar signature, "Still waiting, EM." But this time, there was something different. Below the signature, in the same elegant script, Harold had written a complete message: "Every night until she's ready. 3 years isn't long enough. Still waiting, EM." 6 months have passed since that October night, and the pattern continues. Every evening at 9:45, Harold Morrison returns to visit his wife's grave, and every night he signs the visitor's log with the same message about waiting. I've stopped trying to understand it or explain it to others. Some kinds of love are stronger than death, and some promises extend beyond the boundaries of what we consider possible. I still do my nightly rounds, still check the visitor's log each morning, still note the mysterious signature in my security reports. But now, I also make sure to give Harold and Emma their privacy during that hour, between 9:45 and 10:45 p.m. After 43 years of marriage, they've earned the right to spend time together without interruption, even if that time exists in a space between what is and what should be impossible. The only thing that's changed is my understanding of what "still waiting" really means. Harold isn't waiting for Emma to return. He's waiting for the day when their separation finally ends, when they can continue the conversation that death interrupted but couldn't finish. Until then, he'll keep signing that visitor's log every night, maintaining the routine that love taught him and death couldn't break. Beauty has a way of asserting itself, even when it should be impossible. My name is Rosa Valdez, and I've been the night janitor at Harmony Funeral Home for 7 years. It's steady work cleaning, organizing, making sure everything's perfect for the families who come to say their final goodbyes. The viewing rooms are the heart of what we do here, and keeping them spotless is more than just a job to me. These rooms hold people's last memories of their loved ones, and I take that responsibility seriously. Every surface polished, every flower arrangement positioned just right, every detail tended to with the care these moments deserve. Room 3 is our largest viewing space, with tall windows that let in natural light during day services, and elegant chandeliers that cast a warm glow in the evenings. It's where we hold our bigger services, the ones that draw 100 people or more, to celebrate a life well lived. The room has a formal layout with rows of chairs facing a raised area where the casket sits, flanked by easels for photographs and surrounded by flower arrangements. During my night shift, I spend extra time in room 3 because it sees the most use and requires the most attention to detail. I start my rounds at 11 p.m., after the last family members have left and the funeral directors have locked up for the night. The building takes on a different character. In those quiet hours, peaceful, reverent, but with an underlying sadness that seems to settle into the walls themselves. I've gotten used to the solitude and even come to appreciate it. There's something meditative about moving through empty rooms, restoring order after a day of grief and remembrance. Each viewing room tells a story through its flowers, photographs, and personal mementos, and I feel honored to be the one who tends to these final tributes. Mrs. Patterson's funeral had been held in room 3 back in September, and it was one of the most beautiful services I'd ever seen. Dorothy Patterson had been the town's premier florist for 40 years. and her arrangements graced every wedding, funeral, and celebration in our community. Her signature style was unmistakable spiral patterns that seemed to flow naturally from the center outward, creating displays that looked more like living sculptures than traditional bouquets. The flowers at her own service reflected that artistry, with dozens of spiral arrangements that filled room 3 with color and the sweet scent of gardenias, her favorite flower. The first time I noticed something unusual was about 2 weeks after Mrs. Patterson's service. I was doing my normal cleaning routine in room 3 when I realized the flower arrangements looked different than they had the previous evening. We'd had a small service that day, maybe 20 people, for an elderly gentleman named Mr. Rodriguez, and the flowers had been arranged in traditional linear patterns along the sides of the room. But when I entered for my night cleaning, every arrangement had been transformed into perfect spirals, each one flowing outward from the center, in the exact style that Mrs. Patterson had been famous for. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The flowers hadn't been moved or replaced. They were the same roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums that had been delivered that morning. But somehow, overnight, they had been completely rearranged into patterns that would have taken a skilled florist hours to create. The workmanship was flawless, with each stem positioned precisely to create the illusion of natural spiral growth. It was beautiful, but it was also impossible. I mentioned it to the day supervisor, thinking maybe one of the funeral directors had come back to adjust the arrangements for some reason. But everyone on the day staff swore they hadn't touched the flowers after the service ended. The funeral home's security system showed no signs of anyone entering the building during the night, and all the doors and windows were still locked when I arrived for my shift. The mystery had a logical explanation somewhere, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The next time we used room 3, the same thing happened. A traditional funeral service during the day, conventional flower arrangements positioned in standard patterns, but by the time I arrived for night cleaning, every bouquet had been transformed into one of Mrs. Patterson's signature spirals. This time I paid closer attention to the details, noting the exact position of each arrangement and taking photos with my phone before I left. When I returned the following night, the spirals were still there, unchanged from my midnight discovery, but completely different from their original daytime placement. I started arriving earlier for my shifts, coming in at 10 p.m. instead of 11, hoping to catch whatever was happening to the flowers. Room 3 was always locked after the evening visitations ended, with heavy wooden doors that required a key to open. I had master keys for cleaning purposes, but the funeral directors were meticulous about security, especially in the viewing rooms. If someone was getting inside to rearrange the flowers, they would need either keys or some other way to bypass the locks completely. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to position myself where I could observe room 3 throughout the night. I set up in the hallway outside, bringing a comfortable chair and positioning it where I could see the door clearly. If someone was entering the room to work on the flowers, I would see them come and go. I settled in around 10:30 p.m., after completing my other cleaning duties, prepared to solve the mystery once and for all. At exactly midnight, I heard sounds coming from inside room 3. Not footsteps or voices, but softer noises, the gentle rustling of flower stems being moved, the whisper of petals brushing against each other, the subtle creaking of easels being adjusted. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, like someone working with practiced efficiency. I tried my key in the lock, but the door wouldn't budge. Not stuck, not jammed, but immovable, as if something was holding it closed from the inside. The sounds continued for about an hour, always soft but clearly audible through the heavy wooden door. I could hear the distinct noise of stems being cut, water being poured, and the gentle manipulation of flower heads into new positions. Occasionally, there was a satisfied hum, barely audible but unmistakably humantha sound of someone pleased with their artistic work. At 1 a.m., the sound stopped completely, and when I tried the door again, it opened easily. Room 3 was empty, but the transformation was stunning. Every flower arrangement had been rebuilt into perfect spirals, more elaborate and beautiful than anything I'd seen before. The patterns seemed to flow into each other, creating a unified design that made the entire room feel like the inside of a blooming garden. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias, even though there weren't any gardenias among the day's flower deliveries. And in the center of the room, positioned where Mrs. Patterson's casket had rested during her service, was a single white gardenia laid carefully on the carpet. I picked up the gardenia and examined it closely. It was fresh, with dewdrops still clinging to its petals, as if it had just been cut from a living plant. But gardenias don't bloom in November in our climate, and no florist in town had ordered any for months. The flower was perfect, flawless in a way that only comes from expert cultivation and care. I held it to my nose and breathed in the sweet scent that had always been Mrs. Patterson's signature, the fragrance that customers associated with her shop and her artistry. The next night, I brought a video camera with me, a small digital recorder that I positioned in the hallway to capture whatever happened inside room 3. The door remained locked and immovable during the hour of flower rearrangement, but the camera recorded everything that happened in the corridor. At midnight, the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably, and a soft light began emanating from underneath the door to room 3. Not electric light, but something warmer and more organic, like sunlight filtering through leaves. The recording showed something that made my hands shake when I reviewed it the next morning. Starting at exactly midnight, shadows moved back and forth under the door, the silhouettes of someone walking around inside the room, bending and reaching as if working with flowers. The shadows were detailed enough to show the outline of a dress, the movement of arms and hands, even the suggestion of gray hair pinned up in a neat bun. For 1 hour, the shadows danced under the door, in patterns that matched the sounds I'd been hearing, purposeful, artistic, skilled. When the sounds and shadows stopped at 1 a.m., I immediately unlocked the door and entered room 3. The spiral arrangements were there as always, more beautiful than any florist could create in such a short time. But this time, I noticed something else. The air in the room was warm, much warmer than the rest of the building, and it carried the distinct scent of potting soil and greenhouse humidity. It smelled like Mrs. Patterson's flower shop, with its rows of blooming plants and buckets of fresh-cut stems. I stood in the center of room 3, surrounded by impossible spirals of flowers that had arranged themselves in the style of a dead woman, breathing in air that shouldn't smell like a garden in November. The rational part of my mind kept searching for explanation-hidden entrances, elaborate pranks, equipment malfunctions, but the evidence of my senses told a different story. Mrs. Patterson was still working with flowers, still creating the spiral arrangements that had been her life's passion, still finding joy in the artistry that had defined her 40 years as the town's florist. I've stopped trying to understand how it happens or why it continues. Some talents are too deeply ingrained to be stopped by death, and some people are too connected to their life's work to abandon it just because they're no longer breathing. Mrs. Patterson loved flowers with a devotion that went beyond professional pride, and apparently that love was strong enough to survive whatever transition death represents. 4 months have passed since I first discovered the midnight arrangements, and the pattern continues every time we use room 3. During the day, conventional flower displays for traditional services. At midnight, artistic transformation into spirals that would make any florist weep with envy. I've started leaving small offerings in room 3, packets of flower food, clean water in crystal vases, even gardenia seeds that I order online. They're always gone by morning, and the spiral arrangements seem more elaborate when I leave these gifts. I don't mention the midnight arrangements to the day staff anymore. They wouldn't understand. And honestly, I'm not sure they need to. Mrs. Patterson's nighttime artistry doesn't interfere with the funeral home's operations. If anything, families sometimes comment on how beautiful the flowers look, how they seem to have a life and energy that goes beyond normal arrangements. I just smile and tell them our florist takes special pride in her work. Because that's the truth, isn't it? Mrs. Patterson is still our florist, still creating beauty in the quiet hours when the living world sleeps. Some people find purpose in their work that death can't diminish, and some artists never really stop creating. Every morning, when I find those perfect spirals in room 3, I'm reminded that beauty has its own imperative, its own need to exist. regardless of the circumstances that should make it impossible. Some conversations are meant to last longer than a lifetime. My name is Dave Collins, and I've been the night maintenance worker at Serenity Memorial Gardens for 9 years. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and the hours suit me fine. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., keeping the building systems running while the day world sleeps. The memorial gardens include both traditional burial grounds and an indoor columbarium, a marble-walled room where families can purchase niches to house their loved ones' cremated remains. The columbarium is beautiful in its simplicity, floor-to-ceiling marble walls lined with bronze plaques, each marking a small chamber that holds an urn or two. It's peaceful work, maintaining a space where people come to remember and reflect. My nightly routine covers the entire facility, checking the heating and cooling systems, testing emergency lighting, inspecting the grounds equipment, and making sure all the building's mechanical systems are running properly. The columbarium requires minimal maintenance, just temperature monitoring and occasional cleaning of the marble surfaces. The room stays at a constant 68 degrees year-round to protect the urns and preserve the integrity of the bronze plaques. It's one of the quieter parts of my rounds, a dignified space that feels more like a library than a storage facility. The memorial wall extends from floor to ceiling on 3 sides of the columbarium, with each niche identified by a combination of letters and numbers. Row A sits at eye level, with rows extending up to G near the ceiling, and down to row D at floor level. The niches are arranged in a grid pattern, 48 across and 7 rows high, creating over 300 individual spaces for urns and memorial items. Most niches house single urns, though some families choose larger spaces that can accommodate 2 urns or personal mementos alongside the cremated remains. I first noticed something unusual about 3 months ago during my routine temperature check in the columbarium. It was around 2 a.m., and I was using my infrared thermometer to spot check various sections of the marble wall when I heard what sounded like muffled conversation coming from somewhere inside the wall itself. Not voices from outside the room or sound traveling through the building's ventilation system, but genuine conversation that seemed to originate from within the marble structure. The voices were too indistinct to make out individual words, but the cadence and rhythm clearly suggested people talking back and forth, sharing stories, and catching up on news. I stood perfectly still for several minutes, trying to locate the source of the voices. The sound seemed to be coming from the center section of the wall, somewhere around row C. When I pressed my ear against the marble, the conversation became slightly clearer. Multiple voices, both men and women, speaking in the comfortable tones of old friends who haven't seen each other in years. I could make out fragments of sentences. "How's little Sarah doing in school?" And, "Did you hear about the new shopping center on 5th Street?" The voices carried the warmth of genuine affection and the excitement of people sharing updates about their families and community. I spent the next hour checking every possible source for the sounds. The building's ventilation system wasn't running at that hour, and the columbarium had no plumbing or electrical systems that could create voice-like noises. I walked the perimeter of the building to make sure no one was standing outside talking, and I checked the adjacent rooms to rule out sound bleeding through the walls. Everything was quiet except for the gentle conversation that continued to emanate from somewhere behind the marble wall in Section C. The next night, I positioned myself in the columbarium around 1:30 a.m., determined to document whatever was happening. I brought a small digital recorder and my infrared thermometer, planning to capture both the audio and any temperature variations that might explain the phenomenon. At exactly 2 a.m., the conversations began again, the same warm, friendly voices discussing what sounded like neighborhood news and family updates. This time, I was able to record several minutes of clear audio, though the voices remained just indistinct enough that I couldn't make out complete sentences. While recording, I used the infrared thermometer to check the wall temperature in the area where the voices seemed strongest. Most of the marble read a consistent 68 degrees, but one section showed significantly higher readings. The area around niche 47C consistently measured between 75 and 78 degrees, as if there was a heat source behind the marble. When I placed my hand directly on niche 47C, the bronze plaque felt noticeably warm, almost comfortable to the touch, despite the cool temperature of the surrounding marble. I checked the memorial records the next day and discovered that niche 47C housed the cremated remains of Margaret and William Chen, a married couple who had passed away within 6 months of each other in 2021. According to their memorial information, they had lived in the same neighborhood for over 50 years and were known for hosting monthly gatherings where longtime residents would share news and catch up on community happenings. Their friends described them as the kind of people who kept track of everyone's children, grandchildren, and major life events. The pattern continued every night, conversations beginning at exactly 2 a.m., lasting for about an hour, always centered around niche 47C. The voices became more familiar over time, and I started to recognize individual speakers, an older woman with a slight accent who frequently asked about children's achievements, a man with a deep voice who shared updates about local construction projects, and several others who seemed to rotate through different topics of neighborhood interest. The warmth around slot 47C also intensified, sometimes reaching 80 degrees or higher, while the rest of the wall remained at the building's standard temperature. 3 weeks into this routine, I decided to research the other urns stored near niche 47C. What I discovered gave me chills. The surrounding niches housed the remains of people who had all lived in the same 3-block area of town, a tight-knit neighborhood where many families had resided for decades. There was Mrs. Rodriguez from 46C, who had run a corner grocery store for 30 years. Mr. Thompson in 48C had been the neighborhood mailman for over 2 decades. The Andersons in 47B had lived 2 houses down from the Chens and had been their closest friends for almost 40 years. These weren't random strangers sharing wall space in the columbarium. They were neighbors, friends, and community members who had known each other for most of their adult lives. The memorial wall had inadvertently reunited a group of people who had shared decades of conversations across backyard fences, at community meetings, and during impromptu gatherings in each other's kitchens. Their cremated remains were now housed within a few feet of each other, and apparently their conversations were continuing despite the obvious barriers to communication. I started listening more carefully to the nightly discussions, and the topics became increasingly recognizable. The voices talked about seasonal changes to the neighborhood, new families moving into old houses, and the progress of construction projects they'd all watched develop during their lifetimes. They shared updates about descendants who still lived in the area, celebrating graduations and new babies with the same enthusiasm they'd shown when these families were their living neighbors. The conversations had the comfortable familiarity of people who had known each other for decades and were simply picking up where they'd left off. One night in late October, something changed in the pattern of voices. Instead of the usual group conversation, I heard what sounded like a welcoming ceremony. The familiar voices were introducing someone new, asking questions about their family, and expressing sympathy for their passing. "Welcome. We've been expecting you," said the older woman's voice. "The whole neighborhood's here now," added the man with the deep voice. "Tell us about your grandchildren," we heard Sarah made Dean's List last semester. I checked the memorial records the next morning and discovered that a new urn had been placed in niche 46D just 2 days earlier. Eleanor Martinez, age 79, who had lived on Maple Street in the same neighborhood as all the other voices. According to her obituary, she had been a beloved community organizer who had coordinated block parties and neighborhood watch programs for over 30 years. Her memorial service had been well attended by longtime residents who remembered her as someone who always knew what was happening in everyone's lives. The voices that night included a new participant, a woman's voice with a slight Spanish accent who seemed delighted to reconnect with old friends. She shared updates about her children and grandchildren, asked about mutual acquaintances, and seamlessly joined the ongoing conversation about neighborhood developments. The warmth around the memorial wall expanded to include niche 46D, and when I placed my hand on Eleanor Martinez's plaque, it felt as warm as all the others in that section. I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented of community of friends who had found a way to continue their lifelong tradition of staying connected and sharing news about their families and neighborhood. Death had separated them physically, but their cremated remains were housed close enough together that they could apparently resume the conversations that had been the foundation of their relationships for decades. The memorial wall had become something more than a storage facility for urns. It was a gathering place where old friends could maintain the bonds that had defined their community for generations. 6 months have passed since I first heard those conversations, and the pattern continues every night. The group has grown as more longtime residents from the neighborhood have passed away and been placed in nearby niches. The discussions have evolved to include updates about great-grandchildren, changes to local businesses, and the ongoing life of a community that these friends helped build and sustain for most of their adult lives. The warmth around their section of the memorial wall has become a permanent feature, creating a microclimate of comfort in that corner of the columbarium. I've stopped trying to record or document what I hear during those nightly conversations. Some experiences are too personal to share, too sacred to analyze. Instead, I've started timing my rounds to avoid the columbarium during their gathering hours, giving these old friends the privacy they deserve for their continued conversations. When I do my temperature checks, I make sure their section of the wall is maintaining the warmth they seem to generate. And I've even started leaving small bouquets of flowers near their niches on holidays and special occasions. The conversations continue every night at 2 a.m., filled with the same warmth and genuine affection that characterize these friendships in life. Sometimes I pause outside the columbarium and listen to the gentle murmur of voices sharing news, celebrating achievements, and maintaining the connections that death couldn't break. It reminds me that some communities are strong enough to survive any transition, and some friendships are too deep to be interrupted by something as temporary as the end of breathing. These neighbors spent decades talking to each other across backyard fences and kitchen tables, and apparently, they're not ready to stop just because they're now housed in marble walls instead of living rooms. Love and friendship have their own geography, their own ways of bringing people together, regardless of the physical barriers that should make connection impossible. Some gifts are too important to stop giving, even when the giver is gone. My name is Miguel Santos, and I've been the night janitor at Riverside Funeral Home for 5 years. It's honest work that suits my temperament, methodical, quiet, and necessary. The funeral home operates during regular business hours, but the building requires constant attention to maintain the dignity and cleanliness that grieving families deserve. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., giving me plenty of time to deep clean the viewing rooms, polish the hardwood floors, and ensure every surface gleams for the next day's services. In 5 years, I've developed a rhythm that makes the work almost meditative, moving through empty rooms and hallways with the steady efficiency of someone who takes pride in creating order. The director's office sits at the front of the building, a warm space with mahogany furniture and tall windows that overlook the parking area. Mr. Patterson has run Riverside for over 20 years, and his office reflects both his professionalism and his genuine care for the families he serves. The walls display certificates and community awards, but also personal touches like family photos and small mementos from grateful clients. It's one of the rooms I clean most carefully, understanding that families often meet here during their most difficult moments to make final arrangements for their loved ones. My cleaning routine in the director's office is always the same. Empty the wastebasket, dust the furniture, vacuum the carpet, and polish the large wooden desk where Mr. Patterson conducts his consultations. The desk usually holds neat stacks of paperwork, a leather appointment book, and a small lamp that casts warm light during evening meetings. It's a space designed to provide comfort and reassurance, and I've always taken special care to maintain its welcoming atmosphere. In 5 years of cleaning this office, I've never found anything unexpected or out of place. Mrs. Hendricks had been a regular visitor to Riverside for about 6 years, though not because of any personal loss or family arrangements. She lived in the neighborhood and had gotten into the habit of bringing fresh flowers from her garden to brighten the funeral home's lobby. Every Tuesday afternoon, She would arrive with small bouquets of whatever was blooming in her yard: roses in summer, chrysanthemums in fall, and her prized violets throughout the spring season. She would arrange the flowers in the lobby vases and chat briefly with the staff before continuing on her afternoon walk through the neighborhood. The violets were Mrs. Hendricks' specialty, a variety she had cultivated for decades in carefully tended beds behind her house. She grew both the common purple violets and the rarer white ones, creating delicate arrangements that filled the lobby with their subtle, sweet fragrance. The staff always looked forward to her Tuesday visits, not just for the flowers, but for her gentle presence and the genuine warmth she brought to a place that dealt daily with grief and loss. When Mrs. Hendricks passed away from pneumonia 6 months ago, her absence was felt immediately by everyone at Riverside. The first time I found violets on Mr. Patterson's desk was a Tuesday night in late April, about 2 months after Mrs. Hendricks' cremation service. I was doing my normal cleaning routine when I noticed 3 small purple violets arranged precisely in the center of the desk blotter. They weren't in a vase or container, just laid out in a perfect triangle with their stems pointing toward the chair where visitors usually sit. The flowers were fresh, with dewdrops still clinging to their petals, as if they had just been picked from a garden and carefully placed on the desk moments before my arrival. I assumed someone from the day staff had left them there, perhaps as a small memorial to Mrs. Hendricks, or simply to brighten the office space. The violets were beautiful and seemed appropriate for the setting, so I left them undisturbed and continued with my cleaning duties. But when I returned to the office the following Tuesday night, I found 3 more violets in exactly the same arrangement, a perfect triangle in the center of the desk, fresh and dewy, as if they had just been cut from a living plant. This pattern continued for several weeks. Every Tuesday night, 3 fresh violets arranged in the same precise formation on Mr. Patterson's desk. I started paying closer attention to the flowers, noting their condition and placement. They were always perfect specimens, with no brown edges or signs of wilting, despite having no water source. The stems were cleanly cut, suggesting someone with gardening experience had harvested them carefully. Most puzzling was their freshness. These weren't flowers that had been sitting in storage or transported from a distant florist. They looked like they had been picked moments before being placed on the desk. I mentioned the violets to Mr. Patterson during one of our brief morning conversations as my shift ended and his day began. He seemed as puzzled as I was, insisting that none of the day staff was leaving flowers in his office. He checked with the receptionist, the assistant funeral director, and even the part-time secretary, but no one knew anything about the Tuesday night violet arrangements. Mr. Patterson suggested we review the security footage to determine who was accessing his office after hours, though he seemed more curious than concerned about the mystery. The security system at Riverside includes cameras in the main hallways, the lobby, and the parking area, but not inside individual offices due to privacy concerns for family consultations. However, the hallway camera provides a clear view of anyone entering or leaving the director's office, and Mr. Patterson gave me access to review the recordings from recent Tuesday nights. What I found made no sense. The footage showed me entering the office for cleaning around 11 p.m. and leaving about 20 minutes later, but no one else accessed the office during those time frames or any other time during the night. I started arriving earlier on Tuesday nights, beginning my cleaning routine at 9:30 instead of my usual 10 p.m. start time. If someone was placing violets in the office before my arrival, I would catch them in the act. But when I unlocked Mr. W.W. Patterson's office at 9:45 p.m., the desk was empty except for the usual papers and appointment book. I cleaned the office thoroughly, checking every corner and examining the desk surface carefully before moving on to other areas of the building. When I returned an hour later to lock up the office, 3 fresh violets were arranged in their familiar triangle pattern on the desk. The flowers had appeared during the hour I spent cleaning other parts of the building, despite the office being locked and the security system showing no unauthorized access. I stood in the doorway staring at those violets, trying to process how they could have materialized in a locked room with no signs of entry. The flowers looked exactly like the ones Mrs. Hendricks used to bring: the same deep purple color, the same delicate heart-shaped leaves, the same pristine condition, that suggested careful cultivation and expert harvesting. I decided to spend an entire Tuesday night shift monitoring the director's office, positioning myself in the hallway where I could observe the door continuously. I brought a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, settling in for a long night of surveillance. The office remained locked and undisturbed until approximately 11:30 p.m. when I noticed a faint light emanating from under the door. Not the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights, but a softer, warmer glow like candlelight or early morning sunshine. The light lasted for about 10 minutes, during which I could hear the gentlest sounds of movement inside the office and not footsteps or furniture being moved, but the whisper-soft noises of someone arranging flowers with practiced hands. There was a barely audible rustle of paper, as if someone was adjusting the items on the desk to make room for something new. Then the light faded, the sound stopped, and the office returned to its normal nighttime quiet. I waited another hour before unlocking the office door, giving whoever or whatever was inside plenty of time to complete their task and departure. When I finally entered, the familiar scene awaited me. 3 perfect purple violets arranged in a precise triangle on the desk blotter, their petals still dewy and their stems freshly cut. But this time, I noticed something additional, a faint fragrance in the air that went beyond the sweet scent of the violets themselves. It was the smell of earth and growing things, of a well-tended garden after a spring rain. I approached the desk slowly and examined the violets more closely than I ever had before. They were flawless, with the deep color saturation and robust appearance that comes from expert cultivation. When I gently touched one of the petals, it felt cool and slightly damp, as if it had just been picked from a garden bed in the early morning. The stems showed the clean, angled cuts that experienced gardeners make to promote water absorption and extend flower life. These weren't random violets from some commercial florist, they were garden violets, carefully selected and skillfully harvested. I spent the rest of that shift researching Mrs. Hendricks' background, using the funeral home's records and internet searches to learn more about her gardening hobby. What I discovered deepened the mystery, rather than resolving it. Mrs. Hendricks had been known throughout the neighborhood for her violet collection, which included several rare varieties that she had propagated and shared with other gardening enthusiasts. Her obituary mentioned that she had been working in her garden just days before her final illness, tending the violet beds that had been her passion for over 30 years. More intriguing was the discovery that Mrs. Hendricks' house had been sold 3 months after her death, and the new owners had completely renovated the property, removing all the original landscaping, including the famous violet gardens. The beds where Mrs. Hendricks had cultivated her prized flowers had been replaced with low-maintenance shrubs and decorative gravel. There was no longer any source for the specific variety of violets that continued to appear on Mr. Patterson's desk every Tuesday night. The following Tuesday, I decided to conduct a more direct experiment. Instead of my usual cleaning routine, I spent the entire evening in the director's office, sitting quietly in the visitor's chair and observing the desk where the violets always appeared. I turned off all the lights except for a small desk lamp, creating an atmosphere similar to what Mrs. Hendricks would have experienced during her afternoon visits to arrange flowers in the lobby. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the temperature in the office dropped noticeably, and I began to smell the familiar fragrance of earth and growing things. The air seemed to shimmer slightly near the desk, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but cooler and more gentle. I watched, barely breathing, as 3 violet stems materialized on the desk blotter knot, appearing suddenly, but manifesting gradually as if someone invisible was carefully placing them in their triangular arrangement. The process took several minutes, with each flower appearing as a faint outline before becoming solid and real. I could see the ghost of hands positioning the stems with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. The movements were deliberate and loving, the gestures of someone who found joy in creating small moments of beauty for others to discover. When the arrangement was complete, the temperature returned to normal, and the shimmer in the air faded, leaving 3 perfect violets as evidence of an impossible gift. I reached out slowly, and touched one of the flowers, half expecting it to disappear at my contact. But it remained solid and real, cool and slightly damp, like a freshly picked garden violet. The stems were cut at the familiar angle that promoted water absorption, and the leaves showed the healthy green color of plants grown with expert care. These were Mrs. Hendricks violets, somehow continuing to bloom and be harvested from a garden that no longer existed, arranged by hands that should no longer be able to hold garden shears. 7 months have passed since I first discovered those Tuesday night violets, and the pattern continues without variation. Every Tuesday at 11:30 p.m., 3 fresh purple violets appear on Mr. Patterson's desk, arranged in the same precise triangle that Mrs. Hendricks favored during her 6 years of bringing garden flowers to Riverside. I've stopped trying to understand the mechanics of how it happens, and instead focus on the profound generosity of spirit that makes it continue. Mrs. Hendricks spent years brightening the funeral home with flowers from her garden, understanding that small gestures of beauty could provide comfort during difficult times. Apparently, her desire to contribute that beauty was stronger than death itself, and she continues her Tuesday tradition despite the obvious impossibility of maintaining a garden or harvesting flowers. I've started leaving a small glass of water near the violets, not because they seem to need it, but because it feels like the right way to honor both the flowers and the spirit that continues to provide them. The violets always remain fresh throughout the week, never wilting or losing their vibrant color until the following Tuesday when they're replaced by a new arrangement. It's a weekly miracle that reminds me that some people's kindness extends beyond the boundaries of life itself, and some traditions are too important to be interrupted by something as temporary as dying. Mrs. Hendricks continues to tend her garden and share its beauty, creating small moments of wonder for those of us who still walk in the world of the living. Some professional habits run deeper than the pulse that once sustained them. My name is Janet Morrison, and I've been the night cleaner at Westbrook Funeral Home for 11 years. It's methodical work that suits my temperament, sanitizing surfaces, organizing equipment, and maintaining the sterile environment that families expect when they entrust their loved ones to our care. The preparation room is where the most delicate work happens, where the deceased are made ready for their final viewing and burial. It's a space that demands respect, attention to detail, and absolute cleanliness. Every surface must be spotless, every instrument properly sterilized, and every detail attended to with the dignity these final preparations deserve. My shift begins at midnight when the embalmers and funeral directors have finished their work and gone home for the evening. The preparation room becomes my responsibility until morning, a clinical space equipped with stainless steel tables, drainage systems, and the specialized tools required for embalming and body preparation. It's not work that most people could handle, but I've always found meaning in ensuring that families receive their loved ones in the most dignified condition possible. The deceased deserve the same care and attention in death that they received in life, and I take pride in maintaining the pristine environment where that care is provided. The preparation room houses 4 adjustable tables, each equipped with hydraulic systems that allow the embalmers to position bodies at optimal heights and angles for their work. During active preparation, bodies are positioned according to the specific requirements of embalming procedures, but once the process is complete, they're arranged in their final presentation pose. Traditional placement involves crossing the hands over the chest or abdomen, a positioning that conveys peace and dignity during viewings. This formal arrangement has been standard practice for decades, reflecting cultural expectations about how the deceased should appear during their final farewell. Mr. Reynolds had been prepared on table 2 back in late September, and his case had been straightforward from a technical perspective. He was 74 years old, a retired chiropractor who had practiced in our community for over 40 years. His death from a heart attack had been sudden but peaceful, occurring at home while he was reading in his favorite chair. The embalming process went smoothly, and he was positioned in the traditional manner with his hands crossed over his chest, ready for the viewing that would be held the following day. Nothing about his preparation seemed unusual or different from the hundreds of other cases I'd witnessed over my 11 years at Westbrook. The first time I noticed something odd was during my 1 a.m. cleaning rounds, about a week after Mr. Reynolds' funeral. I was sanitizing table 2 when I realized that Mrs. Garcia, who had been prepared earlier that day, was positioned differently than I remembered from my initial inspection. Her hands, which had been crossed over her chest in the traditional manner, were now resting naturally at her sides, as if she had simply laid down for a comfortable nap. The positioning looked completely natural, even more peaceful than the formal crossed arrangement, but it wasn't how she had been left by the embalming staff. I assumed one of the day staff had returned to make adjustments, perhaps at the family's request or for some technical reason related to the viewing preparation. It's not uncommon for minor repositioning to occur as part of the final preparation process, but when I mentioned it during the morning shift change, the embalmer insisted that no one had modified Mrs. Garcia's positioning after the initial preparation was complete. He seemed puzzled by my observation, but suggested that perhaps the body had settled naturally during the hours between preparation and my cleaning rounds. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the positioning of bodies during my 1 a.m. rounds. What I discovered was a consistent pattern that defied logical explanation. Every deceased person in the preparation room, regardless of how they had been initially positioned, would be found with their hands resting naturally at their sides during my 1 o'clock cleaning check. By morning, when the day staff arrived, the hands were always back in their original cross position, as if someone had carefully repositioned them overnight. The phenomenon occurred with everybody, regardless of age, gender, or cause of death. Elderly patients who had died from natural causes, younger victims of accidents, men and women from all walks of life, all of them underwent the same mysterious repositioning during the late-night hours. The movement was always subtle and natural-looking, never dramatic or disturbing, but consistent enough that I began timing my rounds specifically to observe the pattern. 1 a.m. always showed natural positioning. 7 a.m. always showed the formal crossed arrangement. I started documenting the phenomenon with photographs taken on my personal phone, carefully noting the time and date of each observation. The images clearly showed the difference between the natural positioning I discovered during my rounds and the formal arrangement that was restored by morning. The natural positioning looked remarkably comfortable and peaceful, as if each person had simply chosen to rest in their most preferred sleeping position. The formal positioning, while dignified and appropriate for viewing, appeared slightly stiff and artificial in comparison. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to conduct a more systematic observation. Instead of my usual cleaning routine, I positioned myself in the preparation room from midnight until 2 a.m., monitoring the bodies continuously to determine exactly when and how the repositioning occurred. I brought a comfortable chair and positioned it where I could observe all 4 tables simultaneously, determined to witness whatever force was causing the hands to move from crossed to natural positioning. At exactly 1 a.m., the temperature in the preparation room dropped several degrees, and I began to hear the subtle sounds of movement from the tables. Not dramatic or startling sounds, but the gentle rustling of fabric and the soft whisper of skin moving against the stainless steel surfaces. I watched in fascination as, one by one, the hands of each deceased person began to move slowly from their crossed position to rest naturally at their sides. The movement was deliberate and careful, as if invisible hands were gently guiding each repositioning with professional expertise. The process took about 10 minutes to complete, with each person's hands being moved separately and positioned with obvious attention to comfort and natural appearance. The movements were not random or chaotic, but followed a clear methodology: lift gently, extend slowly, position carefully, adjust for optimal comfort. It was exactly the kind of deliberate, knowledgeable positioning that a healthcare professional might use when helping a patient find a comfortable resting position. I remained in the preparation room until 6 a.m., documenting when the hands were repositioned back to their formal crossed arrangement. The reverse movement occurred at approximately 5 a.m., following the same careful, methodical process, but in the opposite direction. Again, the movement suggested professional knowledge and experience, the kind of understanding about body mechanics and positioning that comes from years of working with patients and understanding how to achieve optimal comfort and proper alignment. During my research into Mr. Reynolds' background, I discovered details that gave new meaning to the mysterious repositioning phenomenon. Dr. Reynolds had built his chiropractic practice around the principle that proper body alignment was essential for both health and comfort. His treatment philosophy emphasized the importance of natural positioning, helping patients discover postures that supported their body's inherent structure rather than fighting against it. Colleagues remembered him as someone who could instantly assess a person's alignment issues and guide them toward more comfortable positioning. More significantly, Dr. Reynolds had been known for his advocacy of natural burial positions. He had written several articles for professional journals arguing that traditional funeral positioning often ignored basic principles of body mechanics and comfort. His view was that the deceased deserved the same attention to proper alignment in death that patients required in life. He had even included specific instructions in his own funeral arrangements, requesting that his body be positioned in the most naturally comfortable manner possible, rather than adhering to conventional formal arrangements. I realized that the mysterious repositioning in the preparation room had begun immediately after Dr. Reynolds' own preparation and funeral. His professional instincts about proper body positioning had apparently continued beyond his death, extending his expertise to every person who shared the preparation room where his own final arrangements had been completed. The careful, methodical movements I witnessed were consistent with 40 years of chiropractic practice, the accumulated knowledge of someone who had dedicated his career to understanding how bodies should be positioned for optimal comfort. The following week, I decided to test my theory by leaving a handwritten note in the preparation room, positioned where Dr. Reynolds would have worked during his practice. The note simply read, "Thank you for continuing to help people find comfort, even here." I left it on the counter near table 2, where his own preparation had been completed, and checked it during my 1 a.m. rounds. When I returned at 5 a.m., the note had been moved to the center of the table and weighted down with a small instrument, as if someone had read it carefully and wanted to acknowledge the message. From that night forward, the repositioning continued, but with subtle differences that suggested a deeper level of care and attention. The natural positioning became even more comfortable looking, with arms positioned at slightly different angles depending on each person's apparent build and structure. It was as if Dr. Reynolds was applying his individual assessment skills to each case, providing personalized positioning based on his professional evaluation of what would be most comfortable for each specific person. I also began finding small adjustments beyond just hand positioning. Shoulders would be subtly shifted to reduce apparent tension, heads would be turned slightly to achieve better alignment, and even legs would be positioned to follow natural body mechanics. The work was so skillful and knowledgeable that the bodies appeared more peaceful and comfortable than any positioning I had seen during my 11 years at the funeral home. Dr. Reynolds was apparently providing the same quality of care in death that he had offered his patients during 4 decades of practice. 6 months have passed since Dr. Reynolds' preparation, and his posthumous chiropractic work continues every night in the preparation room. The phenomenon has become part of my routine of documenting the natural positioning during my 1 a.m. rounds, watching the careful repositioning process, and ensuring that the preparation room environment supports whatever mysterious work is being performed. I've stopped questioning the impossibility of it and instead focus on the profound compassion that drives a healthcare professional to continue serving others even after his own death. I've started leaving small supplies that Dr. Reynolds might find useful: clean towels for positioning adjustments, pillows for additional comfort, even professional chiropractic charts that explain optimal body alignment principles. These items are always moved and apparently used during the nighttime adjustments, suggesting that Dr. Reynolds appreciates having proper tools available for his continued work. The deceased in our preparation room received the most comfortable and professionally appropriate positioning possible, and their families often comment on how peaceful and natural their loved ones appear during viewings. Dr. Reynolds spent 40 years helping people find physical comfort and proper alignment, and apparently his sense of professional responsibility was too strong to be ended by something as minor as his own death. Some dedications to service run deeper than life itself, and some healthcare providers never really retire from caring for others. Every night at 1 a.m., Dr. Reynolds continues his rounds in the preparation room, ensuring that everyone receives the comfort and proper positioning they deserve, proving that the best medical professionals never truly stop practicing their healing arts. Some phone calls echo across years, waiting for someone to finally answer. My name is Keith Rodriguez, and I've been the night janitor at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 7 years. It's solitary work that suits me well, mopping floors, emptying waste bins, and maintaining the quiet dignity that families expect when they come to say their final goodbyes. The building settles into a different rhythm after the last family members leave and the funeral directors lock up for the evening. During those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, I move through empty rooms and hallways, ensuring everything is clean and ready for the next day's services. In 7 years, I've developed a routine that makes the work almost meditative, finding peace in the methodical restoration of order after days filled with grief and remembrance. The consultation room sits near the front of the building, a comfortable space where families meet with funeral directors to make arrangements for their loved ones. It's furnished with soft chairs, warm lighting, and a mahogany desk where contracts are signed and final details are discussed. The room contains a landline phone that connects to the building's internal system, allowing staff to communicate between offices and with the main reception area. The phone system is old but reliable, installed back in 2008 when the building was renovated, with extensions numbered sequentially from 100 to 145 for different offices and work areas. My cleaning routine in the consultation room is straightforward. Dust the furniture, vacuum the carpet, empty the wastebasket, and ensure the tissues and water glasses are properly stocked for emotional family meetings. The room sees heavy use during business hours, as it's where most families spend time making the difficult decisions that follow a death. I take special care to maintain its welcoming atmosphere, understanding that this space holds some of people's most challenging conversations about loss, memory, and how to honor a life that has ended. Mrs. Chen's memorial service had been held at Peaceful Rest back in March, and it was one of the most beautiful ceremonies I'd witnessed in my 7 years there. She had been a piano teacher for over 40 years, and her service featured live performances by several of her former students. The music was exquisite classical pieces that showcased both her teaching abilities and the deep affection her students felt for her. What made the service particularly poignant was the empty chair that had been placed in the front row, reserved for her son David, who was serving in the military overseas and couldn't get emergency leave to attend his mother's funeral. The family had mentioned during the arrangement process that Mrs. Chen had been waiting for David's call when she passed away. He had promised to phone on Sunday evening to discuss his upcoming leave, but she suffered a sudden heart attack on Saturday night and died before hearing from him. Her daughter spoke during the eulogy about how Mrs. Parplink Chen had kept her phone close during her final days, anxious to hear David's voice and discuss his plans to visit home. The missed connection between mother and son added an element of heartbreak to an already difficult service, a reminder of how death's timing rarely considers our plans for connection and closure. The first time I heard the phone ring in the consultation room was about 2 weeks after Mrs. Chen's service. I was finishing my cleaning rounds around 11:45 p.m. when the distinctive sound of the landline echoed through the quiet building. The digital display on the phone showed extension 127, which seemed unusual because I wasn't familiar with that particular extension. I assumed someone from the day staff had forgotten something and returned to the building, so I answered with my standard greeting, "Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, Keith speaking." What I heard on the other end made me pause. Not words or any attempt at conversation, but the soft sound of someone breathing quietly, as if they were listening carefully or gathering courage to speak. Beneath the breathing, almost too faint to notice, was the gentle sound of classical piano music, a piece I recognized but couldn't immediately identify. The music was beautiful and melancholy, the kind of piece that might be played at a memorial service or during a moment of quiet reflection. After about 30 seconds, the line went dead, leaving me with questions about who had called and why they hadn't spoken. I checked with the day supervisor the next morning about extension 127, but she seemed puzzled by my question. According to the phone system directory, extensions only went up to 145, and there was no record of extension 127 being assigned to any office or area within the building. She suggested that perhaps there had been a technical malfunction or crossed wires that caused the incorrect extension to display during an incoming call from outside the building. But the calls continued, always at exactly 11:47 p.m., always showing extension 127 on the caller ID display. Each time, I heard the same pattern: quiet breathing and faint classical piano music playing in the background. The music varied from call to call, sometimes a gentle nocturne. Other times, a more complex sonata, but always performed with the skill and emotional depth of someone who understood both the technical and expressive aspects of classical piano. The breathing never became words, but there was something expectant about it, as if the caller was waiting for a specific response or recognition. I started timing my rounds to be in the consultation room around 11:45 p.m., curious to learn more about these mysterious calls. The phone rang with precise regularity, never varying from its 11:47 schedule. I began recognizing some of the piano pieces works by Chopin, Mozart, and Bach that were commonly taught to advanced piano students. The music quality suggested someone playing from memory rather than reading sheet music, with the subtle interpretive touches that come from years of familiarity with each piece. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to research extension 127 in the building's historical records. What I discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. Extension 127 had indeed existed in the building's previous phone system, which was replaced 15 years ago during a major renovation. That extension had been assigned to a small office that was used for private family consultations, but the room had been converted to storage space when the new phone system was installed. The extension had been officially disconnected and the number retired from use. More intriguingly, I found records indicating that Mrs. Chen's daughter had specifically requested to use the private consultation room during their arrangement meetings. The family had needed extra privacy to discuss the complication of David's overseas deployment and the uncertainty about whether he would be able to attend the service. The room with extension 127 had been where Mrs. Chen's family made their final plans for her memorial, knowing that her son would not be able to say goodbye in person. I started paying closer attention to the piano music during the nightly calls, and I began to recognize specific pieces that had been performed during Mrs. Chen's memorial service. The nocturne that her most advanced student had played as a tribute, the Bach invention that had served as processional music, and the Chopin waltz that had provided a moment of reflection during the service. The mysterious caller was playing the exact repertoire that had been featured during Mrs. Chen's memorial, performed with the same emotional intensity and technical skill that had made her service so memorable. The breathing pattern also became more familiar over time. It had the rhythm of someone listening intently, the way a music teacher might listen to a student's performance, mentally noting both the successes and areas for improvement. Sometimes the breathing would pause during particularly beautiful passages of the piano music, as if the listener was especially moved by the performance. Other times, there would be a soft sigh of satisfaction when a difficult section was executed perfectly. One night in late April, I decided to speak during one of the calls instead of simply listening. When the phone rang at 11:47 and I heard the familiar breathing and piano music, I said softly, "Mrs. Chen, is that you?" The breathing stopped immediately, but the piano music continued for several more minutes. It was a piece I hadn't heard before, something slower and more melancholy than the usual selections. When the music ended, there was a long pause filled only with silence, and then the line went dead. The following night, the call came as usual, but something was different. The breathing sounded more purposeful, less tentative, and the piano music was clearer and more present, as if the source was closer to the phone. I listened carefully to the piece being played, a beautiful, haunting melody that seemed familiar but which I couldn't quite identify. About halfway through the performance, I realized what I was hearing. It was Für Elise, one of the most beloved and recognizable pieces in the classical piano repertoire, but arranged in a minor key that gave it a profound sadness. I remembered Mrs. Chen's daughter mentioning during the arrangement conference that Für Elise had been the first piece Mrs. Chen taught to every new student, a tradition she had maintained throughout her 40-year teaching career. She believed it was the perfect introduction to the emotional expression that classical music could provide, and she used it to help students understand the difference between playing notes and communicating feelings. The minor key arrangement I was hearing seemed to transform the familiar melody into something deeper and more poignant, a teacher's final lesson about the power of music to carry emotions that words cannot express. That night, I made a decision that felt both natural and necessary. When the piano music ended and I heard the expectant breathing, I spoke into the phone with genuine warmth. "That was beautiful, Mrs. Chen. Your students would be proud." I know David would have loved to hear it. The breathing continued for a moment longer, and then I heard something I hadn't expected, a soft, contented sigh that seemed to carry years of maternal satisfaction and love. The calls continued for another week, but with a different quality. The piano music became more varied and adventurous, including pieces I hadn't heard during the Memorial Service Complex compositions that showcased advanced technique and deep musical understanding. The breathing remained present but seemed more peaceful, less urgent. It was as if Mrs. Chen was sharing her full repertoire, demonstrating the complete range of her musical knowledge and passion for teaching. Then, on a Thursday night in early May, the call came with a special significance. When I answered at 11:47, the piano music was Für Elise again, but this time in its original major key, bright, cheerful, and full of hope. The performance was flawless, with every note placed perfectly and every phrase shaped with obvious love and care. When the piece ended, instead of the usual silence, I heard something that made my eyes fill with tears. A voice, faint but unmistakably warm, spoke just 4 words, "Tell him I waited." The line went quiet for a moment, and then I heard the distant sound of a phone being gently placed back in its cradle, followed by complete silence. 2 months have passed since that final call, and extension 127 has remained silent. I still time my rounds to be in the consultation room at 11:47 p.m., just in case, but the phone no longer rings with mysterious calls from a disconnected extension. I've thought often about Mrs. P. Chen's final message and whether I have any obligation to find a way to contact her son David overseas. But I've decided that some messages are meant to be carried in the heart, rather than delivered through official channels. Mrs. Chen spent her final days waiting for a call from her son that never came, but she found a way to continue calling until someone was finally there to listen. Her nightly performances on Extension 127 were both a demonstration of her undying love for music and a mother's persistent attempt to make the connection that death had interrupted. Some conversations transcend the boundaries between life and death, and some love is strong enough to keep trying until it finally reaches its intended recipient. I hope David knows, wherever he is, that his mother waited for his call, and that she filled that waiting time with the music that had been her life's passion. Extension 127 may be officially disconnected, but the love that powered those nightly calls remains as strong and clear as the classical melodies that carried Mrs. Chen's voice across the impossible distance between here and wherever teachers go when their final lesson is complete. Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone, even in death. My name is Linda Garrett, and I've been the night custodian at Harmony Memorial Chapel for 8 years. It's steady work that I've come to appreciate, cleaning and maintaining the viewing rooms, offices, and common areas while families are home sleeping and trying to process their grief. The chapel serves our small community with dignity and compassion, providing a peaceful space where people can say their final goodbyes to loved ones. My role is to ensure that every surface is spotless, every detail attended to, and every room ready to provide comfort during the most difficult moments of people's lives. My shift begins at 11 p.m., after the last evening visitation has ended, and the funeral directors have locked up for the night. The building takes on a different character in those quiet hours, more solemn, more reverent, with an atmosphere that seems to hold the accumulated weight of all the grief and love that has been shared within its walls. I move through the rooms systematically, pushing my cleaning cart from space to space, restoring order after days filled with flowers, tears, and the complicated emotions that accompany death and remembrance. The chapel has 4 viewing rooms, each designed to accommodate different-sized gatherings and various cultural or religious preferences. Room 2 is our mid-size space, comfortable for families of 30 to 50 people, with warm lighting and tasteful decor that creates an atmosphere of peaceful reflection. It's equipped with adjustable seating, easels for photographs and memorial displays, and adequate space for flower arrangements. Like all our viewing rooms, it requires meticulous attention to maintain the pristine environment that grieving families deserve during their most vulnerable moments. My cleaning cart is a standard commercial model, loaded with supplies for sanitizing, dusting, and maintaining the various surfaces and furnishings throughout the chapel. It's designed to roll smoothly on any surface, with well-maintained wheels that allow me to move efficiently from room to room. In 8 years of using the same cart, I've never experienced any mechanical problems or difficulty maneuvering it through doorways, across carpets, or around furniture. The cart is perfectly balanced and responds easily to normal pushing pressure, making my work routine and predictable. Mr. Walsh's service had been held in Room 2 back in October, and it was one of the most heartbreaking ceremonies I'd witnessed during my 8 years at Harmony Chapel. He was 72 years old, and his death had come just 6 months after losing his wife Margaret to cancer. The couple had been married for 48 years, and everyone who knew them described their relationship as extraordinarily close and devoted. Mr. Walsh had cared for Margaret during her long illness, rarely leaving her side and maintaining hope until her final day. According to family members, Mr. Walsh had never fully recovered from Margaret's death. He visited her grave every day, sometimes staying for hours talking to her headstone as if she could hear every word. His children tried to encourage him to seek grief counseling or spend more time with family, but he seemed unable to move beyond the devastating loss of his life partner. His daughter mentioned during the arrangement conference that he had collapsed at Margaret's gravesite just 2 days before his own heart attack, overcome by the weight of grief that had consumed him since her passing. The first time I noticed something unusual about my cleaning cart was about a week after Mr. Walsh's funeral. I was beginning my routine cleaning of Room 2 around midnight when I realized the cart had become difficult to push. Not stuck or caught on anything, but inexplicably heavy, as if someone had loaded it with concrete blocks while I wasn't looking. I checked the contents, the same supplies I always carried, and examined the wheels for obstructions or damage. Everything appeared normal, but the cart required enormous effort to move even a few inches forward. I assumed there was a mechanical problem I couldn't identify, perhaps a bearing issue or wheel alignment problem that was creating unusual resistance. I managed to complete the cleaning using individual supplies carried by hand, making multiple trips to accomplish what normally took one efficient pass with the cart. The next morning, I mentioned the problem to the maintenance supervisor, and he examined the cart thoroughly. He found nothing wrong with the wheels, bearings, or any other mechanical components. The cart rolled normally for him and showed no signs of the heavy resistance I had experienced. The following night, the same phenomenon occurred, but only in Room 2. The cart moved normally throughout the rest of the building, rolling smoothly across carpets, hardwood floors, and threshold transitions without any unusual resistance. But the moment I attempted to push it through the doorway into Room 2, it became almost immovable, as if some invisible force was pressing down on it from above. The weight seemed concentrated on the cart itself, rather than affecting the floor or my ability to walk, creating a localized area of impossible heaviness. I started timing my encounters with this phenomenon, noting that it occurred consistently whenever I entered Room 2 after midnight. During earlier cleaning passes, before the late-night hours, the cart behaved normally in that room. But something about the combination of room 2 and the hours after midnight created conditions that made my cleaning cart impossibly heavy to maneuver. The resistance wasn't gradual or mechanical, it was immediate and absolute, like hitting an invisible wall of dense air. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to experiment with different approaches to room 2. Instead of my usual systematic cleaning routine, I tried entering the room without the cart, bringing supplies individually to see if the phenomenon was specific to the wheeled equipment. The room felt normal when I worked alone, with no unusual resistance or environmental changes. But when I attempted to bring the cart inside, even when it was completely empty, the same impossible weight settled onto it immediately upon crossing the threshold. I mentioned this to my supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, who suggested that perhaps the carpet in room 2 had developed some kind of issue that was affecting the cart's wheels. She arranged for a carpet cleaning service to deep clean the room and inspect for any irregularities in the flooring or carpet installation. The technicians found nothing unusual. The carpet was in excellent condition, properly installed, and showed no signs of moisture damage or structural problems that could affect wheeled equipment. The phenomenon continued despite the carpet cleaning, and I began to notice other subtle changes in room 2 during my late-night cleaning sessions. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees whenever I struggled with the heavy cart, and the air felt thick and oppressive, as if charged with emotional weight rather than physical moisture. Sometimes I could hear what sounded like quiet, sobbing, though I could never identify the source or determine if it was coming from within the room or somewhere outside the building. One night in late November, I was struggling to push my cart into room 2 when I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. Mixed in with the usual sounds of the building settling and the distant hum of climate control, I could distinctly hear a man's voice repeating the same words over and over. I can't. She's gone, and I can't. The voice was filled with such anguish and desperation that it made my chest tighten with sympathetic grief. I recognized the voice as Mr. Walsh's, though I had only heard him speak during brief conversations at his wife's visitation and his own memorial service. The words he was repeating seemed to express the overwhelming grief that had consumed him after Margaret's death, the impossible burden of continuing to live when the person who had given his life meaning was gone. The repetition had a mechanical quality, as if he was trapped in a loop of despair that death hadn't been able to break. The next night, I came prepared with information I had gathered about Mr. Walsh's funeral service. I had spoken with the funeral director who had conducted the ceremony, and he had shared some details about the eulogy that Mr. Walsh's son had delivered. The son had spoken about his father's devastating grief, but had ended with words of comfort, assuring everyone that Margaret was finally at peace and free from the pain of her long illness. "She's at peace now," had been the recurring theme of the eulogy, meant to provide solace for Mr. Walsh's suffering. When I encountered the usual resistance with my cleaning cart and heard Mr. Walsh's voice repeating his desperate words, I took a deep breath and spoke clearly into the seemingly empty room. "She's at peace now, Mr. Walsh. Margaret is at peace now." The effect was immediate and profound. The weight lifted from my cart entirely, allowing it to roll smoothly into the room. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the temperature returned to normal. Most significantly, the anguished repetition of words stopped, replaced by a profound silence that felt more like relief than emptiness. From that night forward, I incorporated those words into my routine whenever I cleaned room 2. As soon as I felt the familiar resistance on my cart and heard the beginning of Mr. Walsh's grief-stricken repetition, I would speak the comforting words from his son's eulogy. "She's at peace now." The cart would immediately become manageable, and I could complete my cleaning duties in a room that felt calm rather than heavy with unresolved sorrow. I realized that Mr. Walsh's grief had been so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that it had somehow become trapped in the room where his own memorial service was held. The weight that pressed down on my cleaning cart was a physical manifestation of the emotional burden he had carried during his final months, the impossible heaviness of living with a broken heart. The repetitive words were his mind's attempt to process a loss that was too devastating to accept or understand. But the words of comfort from his son's eulogy, the assurance that Margaret was finally free from suffering, provided the release that Mr. Walsh's grief-stricken mind had been unable to find in life. By speaking those words aloud in room 2, I was completing the healing process that his death had interrupted, offering the comfort and peace that his overwhelming sorrow had prevented him from accepting during his final difficult months. 6 months have passed since I first encountered the weight of Mr. Walsh's grief in room 2, and the phenomenon has gradually diminished. The cart still becomes heavy occasionally, but the resistance is lighter and brief, as if Mr. Walsh's burden is slowly being lifted through the repeated assurance that his beloved Margaret is at peace. The anguished repetition has been replaced by what sounds like quiet conversation, as if he has found a way to talk with Margaret rather than simply mourning her absence. I've come to understand that some grief is too heavy to carry alone, and some people need help finding their way to acceptance and peace. Mr. Walsh's love for Margaret was so deep that it became a crushing weight when she died, trapping him in a cycle of despair that continued even after his own death. By offering the words of comfort that his grief had prevented him from hearing, I've been able to help him find the peace that love ultimately seeks not, the desperate clinging to what is lost, but the gentle release that allows love to transform from possession into blessing. Room 2 now feels lighter during my midnight cleaning, filled with the peaceful presence of a man who has finally learned to carry his love as a gift rather than a burden. Some nights, when the cart rolls smoothly and the air feels calm, I can almost hear the sound of quiet contentment, two voices talking softly together, sharing the kind of conversation that sustains love across any distance, even the one between life and whatever comes after. Some people spend their final years learning to see with more than their eyes. My name is Carl Brennan, and I've been the night janitor at Serenity Funeral Home for 10 years. It's quiet work that suits my temperament, maintaining cleanliness and order in a place where families come to process their grief and say their final goodbyes. The building requires constant attention to detail, especially the mirrors and reflective surfaces that help visitors check their appearance before viewing their loved ones. People want to look their best during these final moments, and part of my job is ensuring every mirror is spotless and streak-free, providing clear reflections for families during their most difficult times. Serenity Funeral Home serves our community with dignity and professionalism, featuring several viewing rooms, a chapel for services, and comfortable spaces where families can gather privately. The building contains numerous mirrors in the restrooms, hallways, family preparation areas, and even small decorative mirrors in the viewing rooms themselves. These mirrors serve both practical and emotional purposes, allowing visitors to compose themselves and maintain their dignity while navigating the challenging experience of funeral visitations and services. My shift runs from midnight to 8 a.m., giving me plenty of time to deep clean every surface and ensure the building is perfect for the next day's services. The mirrors require special attention because they show every smudge, fingerprint, and water spot. I use professional glass cleaner and lint-free cloths to achieve the crystal-clear reflections that families deserve. In 10 years of this routine, I've developed an efficient system for maintaining all the reflective surfaces throughout the building, ensuring each mirror provides a perfect, undistorted view. The climate control system at Serenity is top-notch, maintaining consistent temperature and humidity levels throughout the building. This is essential for preserving flowers, protecting furniture, and ensuring visitor comfort during services. The system is designed to prevent condensation on windows and mirrors, maintaining optimal conditions that keep reflective surfaces clear and dry. In 10 years, I've never dealt with fogging mirrors or humidity problems that would interfere with the building's pristine appearance. Mrs. Garcia's service had been held at Serenity back in early November, and her story had touched everyone on our staff. She had lost her sight 20 years earlier due to complications from diabetes, and according to her family, She had struggled deeply with no longer being able to see her own reflection. Her daughter mentioned during the arrangement conference that Mrs. Garcia would often ask family members to describe how she looked, whether her hair was neat, if her clothes were appropriate, if she appeared dignified and presentable. She seemed to worry constantly about her appearance despite reassurances from loved ones. The family described how Mrs. Garcia would spend long minutes standing in front of mirrors, moving her hands over her face and hair, while asking detailed questions about what others could see in her reflection. She wanted to know about every detail: the color of her lipstick, the way her necklace fell, whether her posture conveyed the strength and grace she had maintained throughout her life. It was as if she was trying to build a mental image of herself through others' descriptions, creating a visual memory to replace what her eyes could no longer provide. The first time I noticed the mirror fogging was about a week after Mrs. Garcia's funeral. I was doing my routine cleaning around 12:45 a.m. when I realized that every mirror in the building had developed a thin layer of condensation. Not heavy fogging like you'd see in a steamy bathroom, but a delicate mist that obscured the reflective surface just enough to make clear vision impossible. I checked the climate control system, but it was functioning perfectly, maintaining the same temperature and humidity levels as always. I assumed there had been a temporary malfunction in the HVAC system, perhaps a brief humidity spike that had affected all the mirrors simultaneously. I wiped them clean with my usual glass cleaning routine and made a note to have the maintenance company check the system in the morning. But when I continued my rounds and returned to the same areas 45 minutes later, the mirrors had fogged up again, showing the same delicate condensation pattern despite the stable environmental conditions. The fogging occurred every night between 12:30 and 1:15 a.m., affecting every mirror in the building simultaneously. The condensation was always uniform and delicate, just enough to obscure reflections without creating the heavy moisture you'd expect from actual humidity problems. I started timing my cleaning routine to accommodate this phenomenon, wiping the mirrors clean multiple times during that 45-minute window, and documenting the pattern to report to my supervisor. 3 weeks into this routine, I began to notice something disturbing about the fogged mirrors. When I wiped them clean, sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in the reflection that didn't correspond to anything happening in the actual room. Not dramatic or obvious movements, but subtle shifts and gestures that appeared in the mirror but weren't visible when I looked directly at the space the reflection should be showing. It was as if someone invisible was moving through the building, visible only in the brief moments when the mirrors were clear. The movements had a specific quality, tentative and careful, like someone navigating an unfamiliar space or reaching out to touch surfaces they couldn't clearly see. I would glimpse a hand moving across a reflection, or the suggestion of someone leaning forward to examine something closely, but when I turned to look at the actual space, nothing was there. The movements appeared for just a few seconds after I cleaned each mirror, as if the act of wiping away the condensation revealed something that was always present but usually hidden. I started paying closer attention to these reflected movements, trying to understand their pattern and purpose. What I observed was behavior that seemed familiar, someone moving with the cautious, exploratory gestures of a person who couldn't rely on their sight. The reflected figure would reach out carefully before taking steps, pause frequently as if listening for orientation cues, and make the small adjustments that people develop when they're navigating by touch and sound rather than vision. One night in late December, I decided to speak aloud while cleaning the mirrors, addressing whatever presence seemed to move through the reflections. As I wiped the condensation from the large mirror in the main hallway, I said gently, "Mrs. Garcia, is that you? Are you trying to see yourself?" The movement in the reflection stopped immediately, and for a moment, I could swear I saw the outline of a woman standing directly in front of the mirror, her hands raised, as if touching her own reflection. The next night, I brought a small hand mirror with me during my rounds, thinking that perhaps Mrs. Garcia needed a more personal, intimate way to examine her reflection. When the nightly fogging began and I started my cleaning routine, I held the hand mirror up and spoke to the seemingly empty hallway. "Here's a mirror just for you. Take all the time you need to see yourself clearly." The fogging on the hand mirror cleared immediately, and I watched as the reflection showed movements that suggested someone examining their appearance with careful attention to detail. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine of providing verbal descriptions while the mirrors were clear, offering Mrs. Garcia the kind of detailed visual information her family had provided during her lifetime. "Your hair looks beautiful," I would say to the empty room. "Your dress is elegant and dignified. You look exactly like the graceful woman your family described." The movements in the reflections became more confident and peaceful, as if these descriptions were providing the reassurance and comfort that Miss Garcia had sought during her years of blindness. The phenomenon reached its most intense point on a cold January night, when I encountered something that made me question everything I thought I understood about death and consciousness. I was cleaning the large mirror in the family consultation room when the usual fogging cleared to reveal not just movement, but a clear, detailed reflection of Mrs. Garcia herself. She was standing exactly where her reflection should be, looking directly into the mirror with an expression of wonder and recognition, as if she was seeing her own face clearly for the first time in 20 years. Her appearance matched the descriptions her family had given during the funeral arrangement. A woman in her 70s, with silver hair, wearing the blue dress she had been buried in, looking exactly as dignified and graceful as her family had always told her she looked. But what struck me most was her expression of joy and relief, the look of someone who had finally received the answer to a question that had troubled her for decades. She was seeing herself, really seeing herself, with the clarity that had been taken from her by illness but restored by death. I stood transfixed, watching Mrs. Garcia examine her reflection with the careful attention of someone making up for lost time. She touched her hair, adjusted her necklace, and smiled at herself with the satisfaction of someone who had finally confirmed that she was indeed the beautiful, dignified woman her family had always assured her she was. The reflection lasted for several minutes, giving her the opportunity for the thorough self-examination that 20 years of blindness had denied her. When the reflection finally faded, the mirrors throughout the building returned to normal, with no more mysterious fogging or unexplained movements. The climate control system continued to function perfectly, maintaining the stable conditions that kept all reflective surfaces clear and dry. Whatever Mrs. Garcia had needed to accomplish through those nightly visits to the mirrors had apparently been completed, leaving her free to move on to whatever comes after the urgent business of the living world is finally resolved. 5 months have passed since that final reflection, and the mirrors at Serenity Funeral Home have remained clear and normal throughout my nightly cleaning routine. But I've changed how I work with mirrors, especially when families mention that their loved one had vision problems or concerns about their appearance. I take extra care to ensure every reflection is perfect, understanding now that mirrors serve purposes beyond simple vanity. They're windows into how we see ourselves and how we want to be remembered. Mrs. Garcia spent 20 years wondering what she looked like, relying on others' descriptions to build a mental image of herself. Death gave her the gift of sight restored, allowing her to see her own reflection with the clarity and detail that illness had stolen from her. Some people carry questions into death that can only be answered on the other side, and some needs are so fundamental that they transcend the boundary between life and whatever lies beyond. I still clean every mirror with special attention, knowing that reflection is one of the most basic human needs, the desire to see ourselves clearly and confirm that we exist in the world with dignity and grace. Mrs. Garcia's nightly visits taught me that some forms of blindness can only be healed by death, and some reflections are worth waiting 20 years to see clearly. Music has a way of finding its voice even when the instruments fall silent. My name is Pat Sullivan, and I've been the night security officer at St. Mary's Memorial Chapel for 6 years. It's steady work that combines my background in law enforcement with the peaceful atmosphere of a place dedicated to helping families through their most difficult times. The chapel serves both as a funeral home and as a venue for memorial services, with a beautiful sanctuary that seats about 200 people. My responsibilities include monitoring the building's security systems, conducting hourly rounds, and ensuring that all areas remain secure and undisturbed during the overnight hours when the facility is closed to the public. The chapel building dates back to 1958, with traditional architecture that creates an atmosphere of reverence and dignity. The sanctuary features stained glass windows, wooden pews arranged in neat rows, and a raised altar area with a magnificent pipe organ that has served the community for over 4 decades. During my rounds, I check every room systematically: the sanctuary, the viewing rooms, the offices, and the basement areas where maintenance equipment is stored. The building has excellent acoustics, which means even small sounds carry clearly through the corridors and into the main sanctuary. My shift begins at 11 p.m. when the last staff members have left for the evening, and the building is secured for the night. The chapel maintains a climate-controlled environment to protect the organ and other sensitive equipment, and all instruments are powered down after each day's services to prevent electrical issues and reduce energy consumption. The pipe organ, in particular, requires careful maintenance and is only operated by trained professionals during scheduled services and practice sessions. When not in use, the instrument is completely disconnected from power to protect its complex mechanical and electrical systems. The security routine includes checking all locks, testing alarm systems, and ensuring that the building's various mechanical systems are functioning properly. I carry a radio for communication with the central monitoring station and have keys to every room in the facility. The rounds take about 20 minutes to complete, and I conduct them every hour throughout my shift. In 6 years, I've encountered very few security issues, an occasional false alarm or a maintenance problem that required attention, but nothing that suggested any serious threats to the building or its contents. Mr. Morrison had been the chapel's organist for 40 years before his retirement last spring, and his funeral had been held in the same sanctuary where he had provided music for countless services. He was 82 years old when he passed away from complications related to emphysema, and his memorial service had drawn over 300 people who remembered his musical contributions to the community. What many people didn't know was that Mr. Morrison had a personal ritual that he performed before every service. He would place a single red rose on the front pew in memory of his wife Catherine, who had died 15 years earlier. According to the chapel staff, Mr. Morrison had started this tradition immediately after Catherine's death, bringing a fresh red rose from his garden and placing it on the front pew where she had always sat during his performances. He would arrange the rose carefully, making sure it was positioned where Catherine would have been able to see it clearly, and then he would play a brief piece of music dedicated to her memory before beginning the scheduled service. The tradition had continued for 15 years, through hundreds of services, until his final performance just weeks before his own death. The first time I heard organ music during my rounds was on a Thursday night in late September, about a month after Mr. Morrison's funeral. I was completing my 11 p.m. security check when I heard the distinctive sound of pipe organ music coming from the sanctuary. Not loud or dramatic, but clear and unmistakability, deep, rich tones that only a pipe organ can produce. I immediately checked my security panel to see if there had been an unauthorized entry, but all systems showed normal status with no alarms or alerts. I approached the sanctuary carefully, following standard security protocols for investigating unusual sounds or potential intrusions. The music was definitely coming from inside the chapel, and as I got closer, I could identify it as a classical piece, something slow and reverent, the kind of music Mr. Morrison often played as a prelude before memorial services. But when I unlocked the sanctuary doors and turned on the lights, the organ was clearly powered down, with no one at the console, and no signs that anyone had been in the room. The music stopped the moment I entered the sanctuary, leaving me in complete silence, except for the faint hum of the building's climate control system. I conducted a thorough search of the entire chapel, checking every room and closet for signs of intrusion or unauthorized access. All doors and windows were secure, the alarm system showed no breaches, and there was no evidence that anyone had entered the building since the evening staff had left. Yet I had clearly heard organ music coming from an instrument that was unpowered and unattended. I documented the incident in my security log and mentioned it to the day supervisor the next morning. She seemed puzzled but suggested that perhaps there had been an electrical malfunction that caused the organ to produce sound briefly before shutting down. The chapel's maintenance contractor was called to inspect the instrument, and he confirmed that the organ was completely disconnected from power and showed no signs of recent use. The keyboards, pedals, and stops were all in their proper positions, exactly as they had been left after the last scheduled service. The following Thursday night, the same phenomenon occurred at exactly the same time, 11:15 p.m., during my first hourly round. The organ music was slightly different this time, but still classical and reverent, with the characteristic style that I had come to associate with Mr. Morrison's playing during my years of working at the chapel. Again, when I entered the sanctuary, the music stopped immediately, and I found the organ powered down and unattended, with no signs of disturbance or unauthorized access. I started timing my rounds specifically to be near the sanctuary around 11:15 on Thursday nights, curious to understand this weekly pattern. The music occurred every Thursday without fail, always lasting for about 5 minutes, and always stopping the moment I entered the sanctuary. The pieces varied from week to week, but they all had the contemplative, slightly melancholy quality that Mr. Morrison had favored for memorial services and quiet reflection. The sound was definitely coming from the pipe organ. I could hear the distinctive timbre and resonance that no electronic instrument could replicate. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to enter the sanctuary more quietly, hoping to observe whatever was happening without immediately interrupting it. I used my master key to unlock the door silently and entered without turning on the main lights, relying on the illumination from the hallway to navigate toward the organ console. What I saw made me question everything I thought I understood about the building and the nature of music itself. The organ appeared to be playing itself. The keys were moving on the keyboards, the foot pedals were being pressed in sequence, and the stop knobs were being pulled and adjusted as if by invisible hands. But there was no one at the console, just the suggestion of movement, like air currents disturbing the space where a person might sit. The music was beautiful and precise, with the subtle interpretive touches that only come from years of experience and deep musical understanding. I stood transfixed, watching the invisible performance unfold before me. The playing style was unmistakably Mr. Morrison's. I had heard him practice and perform dozens of times during my years at the chapel, and I recognized his particular approach to phrasing and dynamics. The keys moved with the same gentle touch he had always used, and the piece being played was one I had heard him perform many times as a prelude to memorial services. When the music ended, I heard the soft sound of footsteps moving away from the organ console toward the front of the sanctuary. I followed the sound, though I could see nothing but empty space between the pews. The footsteps stopped at the front pew, the same row where Catherine Morrison had always sat during her husband's performances. There, on the wooden bench, was a single red rose, slightly wilted as if it had been there for several hours. I approached the rose carefully, examining it in the dim light from the hallway. It was real fresh enough to retain its shape and color, but beginning to show the signs of age that indicated it had been cut from a living plant earlier in the day. The stem was cleanly cut at an angle, the way gardeners trim roses to promote water absorption and extend their life in arrangements. It was positioned exactly where Catherine Morrison would have sat, placed with the same careful attention to detail that Mr. Morrison had shown during his 15 years of maintaining this weekly memorial tradition. I picked up the rose and held it gently, understanding that I had witnessed something far more profound than a simple haunting or supernatural disturbance. Mr. Morrison was continuing his weekly ritual, maintaining the tradition that had sustained him through 15 years of grief and remembrance. Death had not interrupted his devotion to Catherine or his desire to honor her memory through music and flowers. From that night forward, I adjusted my Thursday evening routine to accommodate Mr. Morrison's unscheduled service. Instead of interrupting his performance, I would wait in the hallway until the music ended and then enter the sanctuary to collect the rose he left for Catherine. I began bringing a small vase with water, placing it near the front pew so that his weekly gift could be properly preserved and displayed throughout the following week. The Thursday night concerts continued through the winter and into spring, each one featuring different pieces from Mr. Morrison's extensive repertoire. Sometimes he played classical hymns that had been Catherine's favorites. Other times he performed complex fugues that showcased his technical skill and musical knowledge. Occasionally, he would play pieces that I had never heard before, perhaps compositions he had been working on during his final years. Musical love letters that he was finally able to complete and perform for his intended audience of one. The roses also evolved over time, sometimes appearing as single blooms, other times arranged in small bouquets that suggested special occasions or anniversaries. On what would have been Catherine's birthday, I found 3 roses arranged together with a small note that read, "Happy birthday, my love," written in Mr. Morrison's careful handwriting. On their wedding anniversary, he left a white rose alongside the usual red one, creating a combination that spoke of both passion and purity, the twin foundations of a marriage that had lasted 47 years. 6 months have passed since I first heard Mr. Morrison's posthumous performance, and the Thursday night concerts have become an integral part of my security routine. I've started researching the pieces he plays, learning about their historical significance and musical structure, developing an appreciation for classical organ music that I never had during his lifetime. Each performance teaches me something new about the power of music to transcend death and the depth of love that some couples share. The chapel staff has noticed the weekly roses but attribute them to an anonymous visitor who wants to honor the Morrisons' memory. I've never corrected this assumption, understanding that some phenomena are too precious and personal to be subjected to institutional analysis or skepticism. Mr. Morrison's weekly services serve no one's schedule but his own, guided by a calendar of the heart that recognizes no authority higher than love itself. Every Thursday at 11:15 p.m., the sanctuary fills with music that officially cannot exist, played by hands that should no longer be able to touch the keys, for an audience of one who has been waiting 15 years for her husband to join her in whatever realm allows love to continue its most beautiful expressions. Some traditions are too important to be interrupted by death, and some devotions run too deep to be silenced by the simple inconvenience of no longer breathing. Some records refuse to stay filed away, especially when they belong to someone who can't find their way home. My name is Eddie Vasquez, and I've been the night janitor at Greenwood Memorial Services for 12 years. It's methodical work that suits my personality, maintaining order in a place where families come to process their grief and make final arrangements for their loved ones. The building houses both administrative offices and a small chapel, with extensive record-keeping facilities that document decades of burials, cremations, and memorial services. My responsibilities include cleaning all areas of the facility and ensuring that sensitive documents and files remain secure and properly organized throughout the night hours. The records room sits at the back of the building, a climate-controlled space lined with metal filing cabinets that contain burial records dating back to the 1920s. These files document every service, burial plot assignment, and memorial arrangement handled by Greenwood Memorial over the past century. The information is confidential and legally significant, requiring careful handling and strict security protocols. During business hours, only authorized staff members have access to the records room, and at night, the area is locked and monitored as part of my security rounds. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., giving me plenty of time to clean thoroughly and maintain the building's professional appearance for the next day's operations. The records room requires minimal cleaning, just dusting the filing cabinets, mopping the floor, and ensuring that any files left out during the day are properly returned to their designated locations. The filing system is meticulously organized by year and alphabetically by surname, creating an efficient archive that allows staff to locate specific records quickly when families need documentation or legal verification. The building's security is straightforward but effective, with locked doors, motion sensors in key areas, and regular patrol checks throughout my shift. The records room has additional security measures due to the sensitive nature of the documents it contains, a separate lock system and environmental controls that protect the aging paper files from humidity and temperature fluctuations. In 12 years, I've never encountered any security breaches or unauthorized access to the confidential records stored in this area. Greenwood Memorial has served our community for over 80 years, and the files in the records room tell the story of thousands of families who have used our services during their most difficult times. Some of the older records document burials that took place when our town was much smaller, including several grave sites that were relocated during major construction projects in the 1960s and 70s. These relocations were handled with appropriate legal procedures and family notifications, but they represent some of the more complicated cases in our historical files. The first time I found the filing cabinet open was on a Tuesday night in early October. I was conducting my usual cleaning routine in the records room when I noticed that Cabinet 7, which contains records from 1960 to 1965, was standing open with one specific file pulled forward. The file was labeled Timothy Anderson, age 7, burial date June 15, 1962. I assumed someone from the day staff had been researching the file and forgotten to close the cabinet properly, so I returned the file to its proper position and secured the cabinet. The next night, the same cabinet was open again, with the same file pulled forward and partially removed from its folder. This time, I examined the file more carefully, noting that it documented the burial of a child who had died in a drowning accident at a local pond. According to the records, Timothy Anderson had been buried in Section C of Greenwood Cemetery, but there was an additional notation indicating that his grave had been relocated in 1978 during highway construction that required expansion of the cemetery grounds. I mentioned the open cabinet to my supervisor the following morning, suggesting that perhaps the locking mechanism was faulty and allowing the drawer to slide open on its own. The maintenance department examined the cabinet thoroughly and found the locking system to be in perfect working order, with no mechanical problems that could cause the drawer to open spontaneously. They suggested that perhaps building vibrations from passing traffic were causing the cabinet to shift, though they couldn't explain why only one specific drawer would be affected. The pattern continued every night for 2 weeks. Cabinet 7 would be found open with Timothy Anderson's file pulled forward, always in exactly the same position. I started documenting the phenomenon with photographs, noting the precise positioning of the file and the consistent way it was displayed each morning. The file never varied in its placement, always pulled forward just enough to make the name clearly visible, but not removed completely from the cabinet. During my third week of dealing with this mystery, I discovered something that made the situation much more disturbing. When I arrived for my shift on a rainy Thursday night, I found not only the usual open cabinet and displayed file, but also a trail of small, muddy footprints leading from the filing cabinet to the window on the far side of the records room. The footprints were child-sized, perhaps fitting a 7-year-old, and they appeared fresh despite the room being locked and secured since the previous evening. I followed the trail carefully, noting that the footprints were barefoot and showed the distinctive pattern of someone who had been walking through soft, wet earth. The prints led directly from Cabinet 7 to the window that faces toward the original location of Section C, where Timothy Anderson had first been buried before the highway construction forced the relocation of several graves. The window was locked and showed no signs of being opened, but there were small handprints on the glass at a height appropriate for a young child. I cleaned up the muddy footprints and documented them with photographs before continuing my normal duties, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. The next morning, I researched the highway construction project that had necessitated moving Timothy's grave and discovered that the relocation had been particularly complicated. The original burial site had been lost during construction, and it had taken several months to locate and properly identify Timothy's remains before moving them to their current location in Section F. The following night, I decided to position myself where I could observe the records room continuously, hoping to understand how a locked cabinet was opening and muddy footprints were appearing in a secured room. I set up in the hallway outside the records room with a clear view through the glass door, prepared to document whatever was happening during the overnight hours. What I witnessed challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between the living and the dead. At approximately 2 a.m., I watched as Cabinet 7 slowly opened by itself, with no visible force causing the movement. The Timothy Anderson file gradually emerged from the cabinet, sliding forward until it reached the exact position I had found it in every previous morning. Then, as I stared in disbelief, small, muddy footprints began appearing on the clean floor, progressing from the cabinet toward the window in the irregular pattern of a child's steps. The footprints appeared one at a time, as if someone invisible was walking across the room, leaving traces in the earth that shouldn't exist on an indoor floor. I could hear the soft sound of bare feet on linoleum and occasionally a quiet sniffling sound, like a child trying not to cry. The invisible presence moved slowly and deliberately, pausing occasionally, as if reading something or looking around for familiar landmarks. When the footprints reached the window, I heard a soft tapping sound, like small fingers touching the glass. The tapping continued for several minutes, creating a rhythm that seemed both desperate and hopeful, as if someone was trying to get the attention of someone outside. Then I heard something that made my eyes fill with tears, a small voice, barely audible, saying, "Mama? Daddy? I can't find my way home. They moved me and I don't know where I am." The voice was that of a young child, frightened and confused, trying to understand why familiar landmarks had disappeared and why the place he was supposed to rest had been changed without his knowledge. The tapping on the window became more urgent, and I could see small handprints appearing on the glass as the invisible child pressed against the barrier that separated him from the outside world he was trying to reach. I stood up slowly and approached the records room door, unlocking it quietly and stepping inside. The footprints were clearly visible on the floor, and the Timothy Anderson file lay open on top of the filing cabinet, displaying the relocation documentation that explained why his original burial site no longer existed. I spoke softly to the empty room. "Timothy, is that you? Are you looking for your family?" The tapping on the window stopped immediately, and I heard the small voice again, closer now and filled with hope. "Do you know where they put me? I was in the place with the big oak tree, but now there's a road there. I can't find my mama and daddy." The voice carried the confusion of a child who didn't understand why the world had changed around him, why the landmarks he remembered from his burial had been replaced with unfamiliar surroundings. I picked up Timothy's file and read through the relocation documentation, finding the current location of his grave in Section F, Plot 23. "Timothy," I said gently, "you're in Section F now, near the Rose Garden. Your mama and daddy visit you there every month on the 15th. They bring flowers and sit with you for a long time. They haven't forgotten about you." The room became very quiet, and then I heard a soft sigh of relief. "The Rose Garden? With the white flowers? I remember that place. It smells nice there." The muddy footprints began to fade from the floor, disappearing in reverse order from the window back toward the filing cabinet. The Timothy Anderson file gently slid back into its proper position, and Cabinet 7 closed with a soft click. 6 months have passed since that October night, and Cabinet 7 has remained securely locked during my rounds. Timothy Anderson's file stays in its proper alphabetical position, no longer pulled forward for nightly examination. The muddy footprints haven't returned, and the records room maintains its usual quiet order throughout my shift. But I've started including Section F in my security rounds, walking past Timothy's current gravesite and sometimes leaving a small flashlight nearby, just in case a lost child needs help finding his way home in the dark. I researched Timothy's family and discovered that his parents had indeed been visiting his relocated grave regularly for over 40 years, bringing flowers on the 15th of each month until their own deaths in the 1990s. Now their adult children continue the tradition, ensuring that Timothy's grave receives fresh flowers and family visits that maintain the connection he was seeking during those confused nighttime searches through the records room. Some relocations involve more than just moving physical remains from one place to another. Timothy had been lost in the bureaucratic transition, confused by the change in his eternal address, and unable to understand why the familiar landmarks of his original resting place had been replaced by highway construction. The records room had been his attempt to find the paperwork that would explain where he had been moved and how his family could locate him in his new location. Death doesn't automatically provide understanding of administrative procedures, and some spirits need assistance navigating the human systems that affect them even after their earthly lives have ended. Timothy's nightly visits to his own file were a child's logical response to being lost. Check the paperwork, find the right address, and make sure the people who love you know how to find you. Even in death, some children just want to make sure they're not forgotten and that their family knows where to look when they come to visit. Some promises echo beyond the grave, especially when they're made by someone who never broke their word. My name is Beth Coleman, and I've been the night custodian at Restful Gardens Funeral Home for 9 years. It's quiet work that allows me to maintain order and cleanliness in a place where families come to process their grief and say their final goodbyes. The building operates with reduced staff during overnight hours, leaving me responsible for cleaning, security checks, and answering the occasional phone call from families who need information or assistance outside of normal business hours. Most nights pass without incident, with only the gentle hum of climate control and the distant sound of traffic to break the peaceful silence. The funeral home serves our community with dignity and compassion, providing both traditional burial services and cremation options for families during their most difficult times. The facility includes multiple viewing rooms, a chapel for services, administrative offices, and a comfortable family consultation area where arrangements are made and grief counseling is provided. My responsibilities include maintaining all these spaces, ensuring they remain clean and welcoming for the families who visit during the day, and monitoring the building's security systems throughout my shift. My work hours run from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., giving me plenty of time to complete thorough cleaning and maintenance tasks without disrupting the day's operations. The phone system includes an after-hours service that routes emergency calls to my desk, allowing me to provide basic information or contact funeral directors if urgent situations arise. Most after-hours calls involve families seeking directions to the facility or requesting information about service schedules, and I've developed a calm, professional phone manner that helps people during their emotionally difficult times. The building's phone system is straightforward and reliable, with caller ID that displays incoming numbers and allows me to screen calls appropriately. During my 9 years here, I've handled hundreds of after-hours calls without any significant problems or unusual incidents. The system automatically logs all incoming calls with timestamps and caller information, creating a record that helps the day staff follow up on any issues that require additional attention during business hours. Mrs. Abbott's memorial service had been held at Restful Gardens back in late August, and it was one of the most well-attended ceremonies I'd witnessed during my tenure. She was 86 years old and had been a beloved figure in our community, known for her volunteer work, her dedication to family, and her remarkable reliability. During the eulogy, her daughter spoke extensively about Mrs. Abbott's legendary punctuality and her unwavering commitment to keeping promises, describing a woman who had never been late for an appointment in her adult life and who considered a promise to be a sacred obligation. According to her daughter, Mrs. Abbott had maintained a detailed calendar and always arrived 15 minutes early for any commitment, whether it was a doctor's appointment, a family gathering, or a volunteer obligation. She had instilled this same sense of responsibility in her children and grandchildren, teaching them that being on time was a matter of respect for others, and that breaking a promise was one of the most serious character flaws a person could have. The eulogy painted a picture of someone whose word was absolutely reliable and whose presence could always be counted upon. The first time I received the unusual phone call was on a Tuesday night in early September, about 2 weeks after Mrs. Abbott's funeral. The phone rang at exactly 2:33 a.m., displaying unknown number on the caller ID screen. When I answered with my standard greeting, an elderly woman's voice asked politely, "Excuse me, dear, but I was wondering if visiting hours have been extended tonight. I'm running a bit late, and I promised I would be there. I explained that the funeral home was closed to visitors until 9 a.m. and asked if there was anything else I could help her with. The caller responded with obvious disappointment, but I promised I'd be there. I never break my promises. There was a quality to her voice, a combination of determination and distress that stayed with me long after the call ended. She hung up without providing her name or asking any follow-up questions, leaving me puzzled about who she was trying to visit and why the timing was so important to her. The next night, the same call came at exactly 2:33 a.m. Same voice, same question about extended visiting hours, same response when I explained that we were closed. But I promised I'd be there. The caller's tone carried the same urgency and disappointment as the previous night, as if she was genuinely distressed about being unable to fulfill a commitment. I started to recognize something familiar about the voice, though I couldn't immediately place where I had heard it before. The pattern continued every night for 2 weeks. 2:33 a.m. Unknown number. Elderly woman asking about visiting hours and expressing concern about keeping a promise. I began documenting these calls in my security log, noting the precise timing and consistent content of each conversation. The voice became increasingly familiar, and I started to suspect it might be a family member with dementia or confusion about visiting schedules, though I couldn't understand why she was calling so late at night. 3 weeks into this routine, I decided to research the voice that was becoming so familiar from these nightly calls. I reviewed the audio recordings from recent memorial services, hoping to identify the caller and understand what promise she was trying to keep. When I listened to Mrs. Prosson Abbott's service recording, I felt a chill of recognition. The voice asking about visiting hours was unmistakably Mrs. Abbott's own voice, the same cadence, the same polite phrasing, the same slight tremor that had characterized her speech during her final years. I compared the phone recordings with the memorial service audio and found perfect matches in vocal patterns, speech rhythms, and even specific phrases. The woman calling every night at 2:33 a.m. was Mrs. Abbott herself, apparently trying to keep a promise that she had been unable to fulfill before her death. But this realization raised more questions than it answered. What promise was she trying to keep, and why was she calling the funeral home rather than visiting a specific person or place? I decided to approach the next call differently, hoping to gather more information about Mrs. Abbott's concerns. When the phone rang at 2:33 a.m. on Thursday night, I answered with extra attention to detail. "Mrs. Abbott," I said gently, "this is Beth at Restful Gardens. What promise are you trying to keep? Maybe I can help you figure out how to fulfill it." There was a long pause, and then Mrs. Abbott's voice responded with obvious relief. "Oh, Beth, dear, I'm so glad you understand. I promised my granddaughter Sarah that I would be there for her piano recital tonight. She's been practicing so hard, and I never miss her performances, but I seem to be having trouble getting there on time. Do you know if they've started yet?" I felt my chest tighten with understanding and sadness. Mrs. Abbott was confused about time and place, apparently trying to attend a granddaughter's recital that had likely taken place before her death. Her legendary punctuality and commitment to promises had created a kind of spiritual obligation that persisted even after her passing, driving her to continue trying to fulfill commitments that were no longer possible to keep in the traditional sense. "Mrs. Abbott," I said carefully, "Sarah's recital was beautiful. You were there in spirit, and she felt your love and support. She played wonderfully, and she knows how proud you are of her musical accomplishments." I wasn't certain about the details, but I sensed that Mrs. Abbott needed reassurance that her promises had been honored and her presence had been felt even if she couldn't physically attend. "Really?" Mrs. Abbott's voice carried such hope and relief. "She felt me there? I was so worried about disappointing her. I've never missed one of her performances, and I couldn't bear the thought of her looking out into the audience and not seeing me there. Keeping promises is so important, especially to children. They need to know they can count on the adults in their lives." Over the next hour, we continued talking about promises, family obligations, and the importance of being reliable for the people we love. Mrs. Abbott shared memories of various commitments she had kept throughout her life school events, family gatherings, volunteer obligations, and expressed her deep anxiety about any situation where she might let someone down. Her identity was so closely tied to being dependable that the thought of breaking a promise, even in death, caused her genuine distress. I learned that Mrs. Abbott had promised to attend several family events during her final weeks of life, but had been too ill to fulfill these commitments. Her granddaughter's piano recital, her great-grandson's baseball game, her book club's final meeting of the year-all events that she had planned to attend but missed due to her declining health and eventual death. The nightly phone calls were her attempts to find a way to still honor these promises, even though the physical possibility had passed. "Mrs. Abbott," I said gently, "your family knows how much you loved them and how hard you tried to be there for every important moment. They understand that illness prevented you from attending those final events, and they don't consider any promises broken. Your lifetime of reliability and love means more to them than missing a few events at the very end." "But I always kept my word," she whispered, her voice filled with the anguish of someone whose core identity had been challenged. "For 86 years, I kept every promise I made. How can I rest, knowing that I disappointed the people I love most?" The question carried the weight of a lifetime spent building a reputation for absolute dependability, and the fear that this reputation had been damaged in her final days. I spent several more minutes reassuring Mrs. Abbott that her family understood the circumstances of her final weeks, and that her legacy of promise-keeping remained intact. I explained that sometimes love means accepting that our intentions matter as much as our actions, and that the people who loved her could feel her desire to be present even when physical presence was impossible. When our conversation ended, Mrs. Abbott thanked me for helping her understand that promises can be kept in ways beyond physical attendance, and that a lifetime of reliability creates a foundation of trust that survives temporary limitations. She seemed peaceful for the first time during our many conversations, as if a burden she had been carrying since her death had finally been lifted. 7 months have passed since that final extended conversation, and the nightly phone calls have stopped. Mrs. Abbott no longer calls at 2:33 a.m. to ask about visiting hours or express anxiety about keeping promises. I like to think she found peace in understanding that her reputation for dependability was secure and that her family never doubted her love or commitment to them, even during her final difficult weeks. I've started paying closer attention to the eulogies at memorial services, listening for clues about unfinished business or concerns that might persist beyond death. Mrs. Abbott taught me that some people carry their core values so deeply that these principles continue to guide them even after physical life has ended. The desire to be reliable, to keep promises, and to never disappoint the people we love can create obligations that transcend the boundary between life and death. Some promises are kept not through physical presence but through the enduring love that motivates them. And some people's dedication to reliability creates a legacy that reassures their families long after the final goodbye has been said. Mrs. Abbott's nightly calls reminded me that death doesn't automatically resolve all concerns, and that sometimes the living need to help the departed understand that their most important promises to love, to care, and to be dependable have already been fulfilled in ways that matter more than perfect attendance at every event. Some gardeners never stop tending their flowers, even when the garden has moved indoors. My name is Rick Patterson, and I've been the night janitor at Harmony Funeral Chapel for 14 years. It's methodical work that requires attention to detail, especially when it comes to maintaining the environmental conditions that preserve flowers and protect the building's furnishings during memorial services. The viewing rooms must maintain precise temperature and humidity levels to keep floral arrangements fresh and prevent damage to wooden caskets and fabric draping. Part of my nightly routine involves monitoring these conditions and adjusting the climate control systems to ensure optimal preservation of everything in the facility. Harmony Chapel serves our community with dignity and respect, featuring 3 viewing rooms of different sizes to accommodate various memorial services. The main viewing room is our largest space, designed to hold services for up to 150 people, with sophisticated climate control systems that maintain stable environmental conditions regardless of outdoor weather or the number of people attending services. The room features hardwood floors, fabric wall coverings, and antique wooden furnishings that require careful environmental management to prevent warping, fading, or moisture damage. My shift runs from midnight to 8 a.m., giving me plenty of time to clean thoroughly and monitor all the building's mechanical systems. The climate control includes both heating and cooling capabilities, along with industrial-grade dehumidifiers that remove excess moisture from the air. These systems are essential for preserving floral arrangements, which can wilt quickly in inappropriate humidity conditions, and for protecting the wooden caskets and furniture that represent significant investments for both the funeral home and the families we serve. The environmental monitoring system includes digital displays throughout the building that show real-time temperature and humidity readings for each room. The main viewing room typically maintains a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity level between 45 and 50%, which provides optimal conditions for both human comfort and preservation of organic materials. In 14 years of monitoring these systems, I've rarely seen significant deviations from these target levels, and any variations usually indicate mechanical problems that require immediate attention. Mr. Chen's memorial service had been held in the main viewing room back in early September, and it was one of the most flower-filled ceremonies I'd ever witnessed. He had been a renowned orchid cultivator for over 60 years, maintaining an elaborate greenhouse behind his home, where he grew rare and exotic varieties that attracted visitors from across the state. His memorial service featured dozens of orchid arrangements, many grown in his own greenhouse, and others donated by fellow orchid enthusiasts who had learned from his expertise over the decades. During the arrangement conference, Mr. Chen's daughter had mentioned that her father maintained his greenhouse at exactly 73% humidity, a level he had determined through decades of experimentation to be optimal for the rare orchid varieties he specialized in cultivating. She described how he would check the humidity levels multiple times each day, making tiny adjustments to ensure his prized orchids received the exact environmental conditions they needed to thrive and bloom. His dedication to these precise conditions had made him famous among orchid enthusiasts throughout the region. The first time I noticed unusual humidity readings was about a week after Mr. Chen's service. During my 3 a.m. rounds, I discovered that the main viewing room was showing a humidity level of 73%, despite the dehumidifiers running at full capacity. This was significantly higher than our normal range, and I immediately checked the mechanical systems for malfunctions. All equipment appeared to be functioning normally, but the humidity level remained elevated for about an hour before gradually returning to normal levels. I assumed there had been a temporary malfunction in the dehumidification system and made a note to have the equipment serviced during the next maintenance visit. But the following night, the same phenomenon occurred: humidity spiking to exactly 73% at 3 a.m. and remaining at that level for approximately 1 hour before returning to normal. The precision of the humidity level and the consistent timing suggested something more systematic than random equipment failure. The pattern continued every night for 2 weeks. 3 a.m. would bring a sudden increase in humidity to exactly 73%, lasting for 1 hour before gradually declining back to normal levels. I started documenting these readings and noticed that the humidity spike occurred only in the main viewing room. The other viewing rooms maintained their normal environmental conditions throughout the night. This localized effect ruled out building-wide mechanical problems and suggested something specific to that particular space. 3 weeks into this routine, I decided to investigate more systematically by positioning myself in the main viewing room during the humidity spike hours. What I discovered was that the elevated humidity wasn't evenly distributed throughout the room. It was concentrated in specific areas where flower arrangements had been placed during recent services. Using a handheld humidity meter, I found that the areas near casket positions with floral displays showed readings of 73%, while other areas of the room remained at normal levels. This discovery led me to research the optimal humidity conditions for various types of flowers commonly used in funeral arrangements. Most cut flowers prefer humidity levels between 50 and 60%, but orchids particularly, the exotic varieties that had been featured prominently in Mr. Chen's memorial service, thrive in humidity levels around 73%. The mysterious environmental changes in the main viewing room were creating perfect conditions for orchid preservation, despite our dehumidification systems working to maintain lower humidity levels. I started paying closer attention to which services preceded the humidity spikes, and I discovered a clear pattern. The elevated humidity occurred only after memorial services that featured significant orchid arrangements or other exotic flowers that required higher moisture levels for optimal preservation. Services with traditional roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums were followed by normal environmental conditions, but any service featuring orchids or tropical flowers resulted in the mysterious humidity adjustments. 1 month after Mr. Chen's service, I had the opportunity to observe the humidity phenomenon. While exotic orchid arrangements were present in the main viewing room, the family had requested that some of Mr. Chen's personal orchids from his greenhouse be displayed during a memorial gathering, and several rare specimens were positioned around the room in carefully placed arrangements. At exactly 3 a.m., I watched the humidity meters climb to 73% while positioned next to one of the orchid displays. As the humidity level increased, I noticed subtle changes in the orchid arrangements that shouldn't have been possible. The blooms seemed to become more vibrant and full, as if responding to the improved environmental conditions. Petals that had shown signs of wilting during the day appeared to regain their firmness and color. Most remarkably, some of the orchid buds that had been tightly closed began to show signs of opening, as if the perfect humidity was encouraging them to bloom despite being cut flowers in a funeral arrangement. I moved between the various orchid displays, noting that each arrangement seemed to be receiving individual attention in terms of humidity optimization. Some areas registered slightly higher readings than others, suggesting that different orchid varieties were receiving customized environmental conditions based on their specific preservation needs. The invisible presence seemed to possess expert knowledge about the requirements of each orchid type, providing precisely the right conditions for optimal preservation and display. At 3:30 a.m., I heard something that made me understand the true nature of what was happening in the main viewing room. Very faintly, almost too quiet to detect, I could hear the sound of someone moving among the flower arrangements, not footsteps, but the gentle sounds of someone examining plants closely and making subtle adjustments to their positioning. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like satisfied humming, the kind of sound a dedicated gardener makes when pleased with their plant's condition and growth. The sounds were accompanied by subtle changes in the orchid arrangements that became visible as I watched more carefully. Stems were being repositioned slightly to improve their access to the optimal humidity zones. Wilted leaves were being removed so gently that I could barely detect the motion. Some arrangements were being adjusted to ensure that emerging buds received the best possible exposure to the carefully controlled environmental conditions. I realized that Mr. Chen was continuing his 60-year tradition of orchid cultivation, applying his expert knowledge to ensure that the flowers displayed during memorial services received the same meticulous care he had provided in his greenhouse. The humidity spikes to exactly 73% were his way of creating optimal preservation conditions for the orchids and exotic flowers that families brought to honor their loved ones. His expertise and dedication to horticultural excellence had survived his death, extending his care to flowers that needed his specialized knowledge. At 4 a.m., as the humidity levels gradually returned to normal, I heard one final sound that confirmed my understanding of the phenomenon. Very softly, almost like a whisper, I heard Mr. Chen's voice saying, "There, that should keep them beautiful for the families. Every flower deserves the best care, especially during these important times." The voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had completed important work and ensured that his standards of excellence continued to be maintained. 6 months have passed since I first encountered Mr. Chen's nocturnal horticulture work, and the pattern continues whenever exotic flowers or orchids are displayed in the main viewing room. The humidity spikes still occur at 3 a.m., lasting for exactly 1 hour and providing optimal preservation conditions for flowers that require specialized care. I've stopped trying to adjust the dehumidification systems during these periods, understanding that Mr. Chen's expertise creates better preservation conditions than any mechanical system could provide. I've started coordinating with the day staff to ensure that families with orchid arrangements are scheduled for the main viewing room, knowing that Mr. Chen's continued care will keep their flowers looking beautiful throughout the memorial services. The orchids in our facility stay fresh longer than they should, often maintaining their beauty for days beyond what cut flowers normally survive. Families frequently comment on how magnificent their floral arrangements look, never knowing that a master horticulturist continues to tend their loved ones' flowers with 60 years of accumulated expertise. Mr. Chen spent his life creating optimal conditions for rare and beautiful orchids, and apparently death hasn't diminished his commitment to horticultural excellence. Some passions run so deep that they transcend physical limitations, and some expertise is too valuable to be lost simply because the expert is no longer breathing. Every night at 3 a.m., the main viewing room becomes Mr. Chen's greenhouse, where perfect humidity conditions ensure that every orchid receives the care it deserves during its final performance. The flowers at Harmony Chapel benefit from care that no living horticulturist could provide the attention of someone whose dedication to cultivation has survived the transition from life to whatever comes after, ensuring that beauty continues to flourish even in places associated with endings and farewells. Some habits run so deep that death becomes just another walking partner. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been the night security guard at Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens for 5 years. It's a position that requires vigilance, attention to detail, and comfort with solitude during the long hours between sunset and dawn. The memorial gardens include both indoor facilities and extensive outdoor grounds, requiring comprehensive security coverage to protect the property and ensure the peaceful environment that grieving families expect when they visit. My responsibilities include monitoring security systems, conducting regular patrols, and maintaining detailed logs of all activities and observations during my shift. The security protocols at Eternal Rest are thorough and professional, utilizing a combination of electronic monitoring systems and physical patrol procedures to ensure complete coverage of the facility. I wear a digital footstep counter that tracks my movement throughout the building and grounds, providing an accurate record of patrol completion and timing. The system includes motion sensors throughout the facility that detect movement and automatically log the number of people present in each area. Additionally, security cameras monitor key locations, creating a comprehensive record of all activity during overnight hours. My shift begins at 10 p.m. and continues until 6 a.m., during which I conduct hourly perimeter walks that cover both the indoor memorial facilities and the outdoor cemetery grounds. The perimeter route takes approximately 30 minutes to complete and includes checkpoints at various locations throughout the property. The footstep counter provides an accurate tally of the distance covered and helps ensure that each patrol follows the complete prescribed route without shortcuts or omissions. The digital systems at Eternal Rest are state-of-the-art, installed 3 years ago as part of a comprehensive security upgrade. The footstep counter uses advanced accelerometer technology to provide precise measurements of walking distance and step count, while the motion sensors utilize infrared detection to monitor movement throughout the facility. These systems work together to create detailed logs that document security coverage and can provide evidence in case of any incidents or unauthorized access to the property. Mr. Patterson's memorial service had been held at Eternal Rest back in late October, and his story had touched everyone on our staff. He was 79 years old when he passed away from complications following a stroke, dying just 6 months after losing his wife Eleanor to cancer. According to family members who spoke during the service, Frank and Eleanor Patterson had taken evening walks together for 53 years of marriage, maintaining this routine through decades of weather changes, health challenges, and life transitions. The walks had been their sacred time together, a daily ritual that strengthened their bond and provided them with shared exercise and conversation. Eleanor's death had devastated Frank, and his family described how he had continued taking their evening walks alone, following the same route they had traveled together for over 5 decades. Neighbors would see him walking slowly through their neighborhood each evening around sunset, often pausing at places where he and Eleanor had enjoyed stopping to admire flowers or chat with friends. His daughter mentioned that Frank seemed lost without his walking companion, as if he was following a path that only made sense when traveled with the person who had shared it with him for most of his adult life. The first time I noticed discrepancies in my security logs was about 2 weeks after Mr. Patterson's funeral. At the end of my shift, I reviewed the night's data and discovered that my footstep counter showed a mileage total that was slightly higher than the prescribed patrol route should have generated. Not dramatically higher, but consistently about 10% more steps than my usual nightly total. I assumed the device was malfunctioning, or perhaps I had taken a longer path without realizing it, but I made a note to monitor the readings more carefully during subsequent shifts. The pattern continued for several nights' footstep counts that exceeded my expected totals by small but consistent margins. More puzzling was the motion sensor data, which showed detection of 2 figures during my perimeter walks, rather than the single detection that should correspond to my solitary patrols. The reading suggested that someone was walking alongside me during my rounds, maintaining a pace and route that paralleled my own movements throughout the building and grounds. I reviewed the security camera footage to determine if someone was somehow accessing the property and accompanying me during patrols without my knowledge. The video clearly showed me walking alone through all monitored areas, with no signs of unauthorized persons or unusual activity. Yet the motion sensors continued to register dual detections, and my footstep counter maintained its pattern of elevated readings that suggested additional walking beyond my individual movement. 3 weeks into this pattern, I decided to pay closer attention to my physical sensations during the perimeter walks, hoping to understand what might be causing the discrepant readings. As I walked through the memorial gardens, I began to notice a subtle sensation of companionship, not anything I could see or hear, but a presence that seemed to keep pace with my movements. It felt like having a walking partner who matched my stride and maintained a comfortable distance, the way 2 people do when they've walked together regularly for many years. The sensation was strongest during the portions of my patrol that covered the outdoor cemetery grounds, particularly along the pathways that wound through the older sections where long-term couples were buried side by side. In these areas, my footstep counter showed its highest discrepancies, sometimes registering nearly 20% more steps than I was actually taking. The motion sensors in these sections consistently detected 2 figures, despite the security cameras showing only my individual presence moving through the moonlit pathways. 1 month after Mr. Patterson's service, I encountered something during my patrol that made the invisible companion phenomenon impossible to ignore. I was walking through Section D of the cemetery grounds, an area where many elderly couples were buried together, when I felt a distinct change in the walking rhythm beside me. The presence that had been maintaining my pace suddenly slowed, and I found myself instinctively slowing as well, as if responding to a walking partner who needed to rest or examine something along the path. I stopped near a bench that overlooked a small garden area, and for several minutes I stood quietly, feeling as though I was sharing a peaceful moment with someone who appreciated the same nighttime tranquility that I had come to enjoy during my years of security work. The sensation was comforting rather than frightening, like having a companion who understood the contemplative nature of walking through spaces dedicated to memory and reflection. During this pause, I heard something that confirmed my growing understanding of what was happening during my nightly patrols. Very softly, almost too quiet to be certain, I heard the sound of someone breathing beside me, no labored or distressed, but the natural breathing of someone resting after gentle exercise. Occasionally, I caught fragments of what sounded like quiet conversation, as if someone was sharing observations about the peaceful beauty of the memorial gardens or commenting on the changes that occurred in the landscaping from season to season. The invisible conversation had the comfortable quality of long-married couples who can communicate with minimal words, sharing thoughts and observations that build on decades of shared experiences. Sometimes I heard what sounded like gentle laughter, as if someone was enjoying a private joke or remembering a happy memory associated with evening walks. The sounds carried affection and contentment, suggesting that whoever was walking with me found joy and comfort in continuing a beloved routine. As my patrol continued that night, I began to understand that Mr. Patterson was maintaining his 53-year tradition of evening walks, but now he was no longer walking alone. Somehow, Eleanor had joined him again, and together they were following the paths through eternal rest, just as they had followed neighborhood streets during their decades of marriage. My security patrols had become their opportunity to resume the shared activity that had been the foundation of their daily connection for over half a century. The footstep counter readings made perfect sense once I understood that I was actually walking with two people rather than walking alone. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were maintaining their own pace and route, sometimes diverging slightly from my prescribed patrol path to explore areas of the memorial gardens that interested them, or to pause at locations that held special meaning. Their steps were being counted along with mine, creating the elevated readings that had puzzled me for weeks. Over the following months, I adjusted my patrol routine to accommodate my invisible walking companions, allowing extra time for the pauses and detours that Frank and Eleanor seemed to prefer. I started varying my route slightly to include areas of the memorial gardens that offered particularly beautiful views or interesting features. Understanding that the Pattersons were using these walks to explore their eternal home and perhaps to continue the conversations that had filled their evening walks for 53 years. The motion sensors continued to register dual detections during my patrols, and my footstep counter maintained its pattern of elevated readings that documented the presence of additional walkers. But rather than viewing these discrepancies as security concerns, I began to see them as evidence of something beautiful, a couple whose love for each other and for their shared routine was strong enough to survive the separation that death had temporarily imposed on their partnership. 8 months have passed since Mr. Patterson's funeral, and my nightly patrols continue to include the invisible companionship of Frank and Eleanor Patterson. The security logs document their presence through elevated step counts and dual motion detections, creating an official record of their ongoing evening walks through the memorial gardens. I've learned to appreciate the peaceful presence they bring to my solitary work, and I sometimes find myself slowing my pace to accommodate their preferred walking speed or pausing at locations where they seem to want to rest and enjoy the view. Some routines are too deeply ingrained to be interrupted by death, and some partnerships are too strong to be dissolved by physical separation. Frank and Eleanor Patterson spent 53 years walking together, and apparently they see no reason to stop now that they're both residing in the same peaceful location. My security patrols have become their evening constitutional, a continuation of the shared activity that sustained their marriage and provided them with daily time for connection and conversation. The memorial gardens benefit from their presence. I think a couple whose love for walking and for each other adds a layer of contentment and purpose to the nightly rounds that keep the facility secure. Some security guards walk alone through empty buildings, but I have the privilege of walking with two people whose commitment to each other created a bond strong enough to resume their favorite activity the moment they were reunited in their final home.